At 20, my parents threw my suitcase onto the driveway in the pouring rain because I was pregnant by my electrician boyfriend. His blue-collar job will disgrace our family, my mother screamed, locking the heavy mahogany door of our estate. He did not flinch. We married without a single relative from my side in attendance. After 15 years of absolute silence, the doorbell rang at 11 at night during a massive thunderstorm. I opened it to find my mother shaking and sobbing, demanding we mortgage our house because the FBI just arrested my father. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch karma finally catch up to the people who threw you away like garbage. My name is Gemma, 35 years old, and I am currently the chief operating officer of a massive commercial electrical contracting firm. I built this life from absolute scratch alongside my husband Luke, who is 37. Together we have a brilliant 14-year-old son named Leo, who has grown up surrounded by the unconditional love and respect that my own parents never bothered to give me. For a decade and a half, my biological family treated me like a ghost. They never called when Leo was born. They never reached out when we bought our first small starter home, nor did they check in when the economy took a downturn. They simply erased me from their perfect high society narrative. But on a Tuesday night, right in the middle of a torrential Pacific Northwest storm, the ghost decided to come back to life. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our custom-built smart home. Luke had just gone into his home office to review some architectural blueprints for a new hospital grid we were contracted to build, and I was reading a book on the living room sofa. When the frantic, aggressive pounding on the solid oak front door echoed through the foyer, I immediately checked the security cameras on my tablet. I expected a lost driver or a neighbor dealing with a fallen tree branch. Instead, standing on my porch, drenched and shivering, was Patricia, the woman who gave birth to me, the woman who had not spoken my name in 15 years. I walked to the entryway, my bare feet silent against the heated hardwood floors. I pulled the door open, letting the freezing wind whip through the foyer. Patricia pushed past me without a single word of greeting. She did not ask how I was. She did not even look at my face to see how I had aged. Her designer trench coat was clinging to her thin frame, and her expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, muddy streams. She stood in the center of my entryway, panting heavily, her eyes darting around wildly in pure panic. "Your father has been arrested!" She gasped out, her voice a hysterical shriek that echoed off the high ceilings. The FBI raided our house 3 hours ago. They came with a warrant for securities fraud and insider trading. They took his computers, his files, his phone. The SEC has frozen absolutely everything, Gemma. The bank accounts, the investment portfolios, the retirement funds, even the emergency offshore accounts. We cannot access a single cent. You have to let me stay here tonight. I slowly closed the front door, shutting out the storm, and turned to look at her. Patricia was practically hyperventilating, pacing back and forth across the custom rug in the foyer. She took no notice of the expansive architecture around her, the curated art on the walls, or the sheer scale of the home she was standing in. In her panicked state, she likely assumed this was just a lucky rental, or that we were buried in unmanageable debt to afford a decent neighborhood. She unclasped her ruined, soaking wet Hermes handbag and tossed it carelessly onto a pristine, custom-upholstered armchair in the hallway, completely disregarding the water damage she was causing to my property. "Go get Luke," she ordered, waving her hand at me dismissively, as if I were a hired maid. "Tell your electrician husband to go to the kitchen and brew me some tea. I need something to calm my nerves immediately. It has been an absolute nightmare." The neighbors were watching from their windows when they put Richard in the back of the federal vehicle. The humiliation is unbearable. "Go on, Gemma, get him to make the tea." I did not move. I did not raise my voice or react to her frantic energy. I simply reached over to a side table, pulled a tissue from a decorative box, and held it out to her. "The last time I saw you," I said, my voice steady and cold, "you were tossing my belongings onto the wet pavement. You stood on your porch and told me that the child growing inside me was a mistake and a disgrace because his father was just a broke electrician who would never amount to anything. You told me to never show my face in your pristine neighborhood again." And now, 15 years later, you show up at that exact same electrician's house in the middle of the night uninvited and demand that he serve you tea. Patricia snatched the tissue from my hand and dabbed aggressively at her ruined makeup. She scoffed, rolling her eyes, as if I were bringing up a minor inconvenient misunderstanding rather than a life-altering trauma. "Oh, please, Gemma, do not do this right now," she snapped, her tone dripping with toxic condescension. "You are young and foolish. We were just trying to protect the family image, and we wanted what was best for you. We were applying tough love so you would wake up and realize the mistake you were making. You cannot possibly hold a grudge over something that happened so long ago. You need to let the past go because our family is in an actual crisis right now. I do not have the time or the patience for your typical emotional drama." She began pacing again, her wet heels squeaking against the wood floor. "Your father needs bail money," she continued, completely ignoring my silence. "His lawyers managed to get a hearing, but the judge set the bail at $200,000 because he is considered a flight risk due to the offshore accounts. The bondsman wants at least $20,000 in cash and collateral for the rest. Since the feds froze all our liquid assets, I need you to do this for us. You and Luke need to go to the bank tomorrow morning and take out a second mortgage on this house. I know Luke has been working in the trades for a long time, so he must have paid down enough of the mortgage to give you some equity. You can leverage the house to secure your father's release." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the sheer audacity of her demands. After a decade and a half of ignoring my existence, she had marched into my home and demanded I put a lien on my property to save the man who had cast me out. She had completely fabricated a reality where we were desperate blue-collar workers barely scraping by on a 30-year fixed mortgage, while they were the noble, wealthy elites suffering a temporary misunderstanding with federal authorities. Before I could formulate a response that would adequately convey my disgust, the door to the home office opened. Luke stepped out into the hallway. He was not wearing dirty work boots or a frayed utility shirt. He was dressed in a simple but incredibly expensive charcoal cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. His presence was commanding, exuding the quiet, undeniable confidence of a man who managed hundreds of employees and oversaw multi-million-dollar contracts on a daily basis. He walked over and stood beside me, wrapping a reassuring arm around my waist. "Hello, Patricia," Luke said. His voice was remarkably calm, carrying the smooth authority of a CEO dealing with a difficult vendor. Patricia looked him up and down, a flicker of confusion crossing her features as she processed his polished appearance. But she quickly masked it with her usual arrogance. "Luke," she said sharply, "Gemma was just about to tell you the situation. Richard has been wrongfully detained, and we need to use this house as collateral for his bail bond. I need you to get the deed and your mortgage statements ready for tomorrow morning." Luke looked at her, his expression entirely unbothered. "First of all, Patricia, this house does not have a mortgage. We own it free and clear. Second, even if we did have the liquidity sitting in a casual checking account, which we do, we have absolutely no legal or moral obligation to bail out a white-collar criminal. Your husband is facing federal charges for stealing from investors. We do not use our hard-earned money to rescue thieves, especially not ones who abandoned my wife when she was carrying my son." Patricia's jaw dropped. The color rushed into her face, turning her cheeks an angry mottled red. "You insolent, arrogant man," she hissed, pointing a shaking finger at him. "You think because you finally paid off a house that you can speak to me this way. Richard is an investment banker. He built a financial empire. This is just a witch hunt by the SEC. You owe us respect." "Respect is earned," Patricia, Luke replied smoothly. "You lost yours 15 years ago." Patricia let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "Fine. If you are going to be stubborn and stupid about this, I will just have to bring in the real professionals. I already texted your sister Chelsea and her husband Preston on my way over here. They are driving up from the city right now. Preston works in wealth management. He understands exactly how these federal freezes work, and he knows how to structure a rapid equity loan. They are going to come here and teach you too how the real world of finance and law operates. You will sign the papers when Preston explains the legal implications to you." She crossed her arms, standing in the middle of my foyer like a queen awaiting her royal guard, completely oblivious to how pathetic she looked, dripping rainwater onto the floor. Chelsea was her golden child. 3 years younger than me, Chelsea had always played the game perfectly. She married Preston, a slick, fast-talking finance bro who drove leased luxury cars and wore suits that cost more than his actual net worth. My parents adored Preston because he worked in the same industry as my father. They considered him the son they never had the perfect high society match for their perfect daughter. Less than 10 minutes later, headlights swept across the large frosted windows of our front doors. A vehicle pulled aggressively into the circular driveway. I glanced at the security monitor mounted on the wall. It was a late-model European luxury SUV. But as I looked closer at the high-definition camera feed, a smirk tugged at the corner of my mouth. Mounted directly beneath the steering column, visible through the windshield in the bright glare of our outdoor security lights, was a small, blinking black box. It was a GPS starter interrupt device. Banks only installed those on vehicles when the owner was chronically behind on their exorbitant lease payments and was considered a high risk for repossession. The great financial wizard Preston was apparently drowning in his own personal debt. The doorbell chimed aggressively. I opened the door and Chelsea pushed her way inside, dragging Preston behind her. Chelsea looked exactly as I remembered, though her face was tighter layered with expensive cosmetic procedures. She was wearing a designer raincoat and carrying a luxury umbrella, shaking the water off onto my floor without a second thought. Preston followed, running a hand through his heavily gelled hair, trying to look imposing and authoritative. "God, it took us forever to find this place," Chelsea complained loudly, shivering as she shrugged off her coat. The GPS kept routing us through those working-class developments near the highway. "I cannot believe you actually live all the way out here, Gemma. It is so isolated. Get me a glass of water, please, but make sure it is bottled. I do not drink unfiltered tap water." I stared at my sister. She was seeking refuge in my home because our parents were about to be indicted by the federal government, and her first instinct was to insult my neighborhood and demand imported water. I walked into the kitchen, filled a plain glass with water straight from the refrigerator dispenser, and walked back to hand it to her. "Here is your tap water," I said bluntly. "Drink it or leave it on the table." Chelsea glared at me, offended by my tone, but she was too thirsty to argue. She took a sip and grimaced as if it were poison. Preston stepped forward, puffing out his chest. He clapped his hands together, forcing a hearty, patronizing smile. "All right, let us skip the family reunions and get down to brass tacks," Preston said, looking directly at Luke and ignoring me completely. "Listen, Luke, I know you are a blue-collar guy. You work with your hands, you pull wire, you do the heavy lifting. That is great, honest work. But federal asset freezes and bond collateralization are highly complex financial mechanisms. They require a sophisticated understanding of liquidity and leveraged assets. Richard is in a bind, and we need to move capital fast." Preston pulled a sleek leather folder from his briefcase and slapped it down on my entry table. He opened it to reveal a stack of legal documents. "I have drawn up a short-term promissory note and a deed of trust agreement." Preston continued, using a tone one might use to explain a math problem to a toddler. "Basically, you and Gemma sign these papers granting my LLC the right to put a lien on this property. I will take this agreement to my private lenders tomorrow morning, secure the $200,000 in cash, and bail Richard out. Once the SEC clears up this ridiculous misunderstanding and unfreezes Richard's accounts, we will pay off the lien and you get your house back safe and sound. It is a foolproof strategy. Just sign here at the bottom and let the men handle the complicated stuff." Luke looked down at the paperwork. He did not touch the pen Preston was holding out. He read the top paragraph of the document and then slowly looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. I looked back at Luke, and a silent, sharp understanding passed between us. The documents Preston had brought were not standard bail bond collateral agreements. They were structured as an irrevocable transfer of equity. Preston was not trying to save Richard. Preston was trying to use the chaos of the FBI raid to trick us into signing over the equity of our home directly to his own struggling company, likely to pay off his own mounting debts and save his repossessed cars. The absolute sheer audacity of these people. They had come to my house in the dead of night seeking salvation, and their first instinct was to attempt a predatory financial scam against the daughter they had discarded 15 years ago. They thought we were uneducated, gullible tradespeople who would be blinded by their fancy terminology. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The game had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy dismantling their entire world piece by piece. Luke slid the leather folder back across the entry table, his hand resting casually over Preston's knuckles, stopping him from opening the documents any further. "It is past midnight, Preston." Luke said, his voice entirely devoid of the intimidation Preston was trying to project. "Gemma and I do not sign binding financial documents without our legal team reviewing them during business hours. You can sleep in the guest wing tonight. We will discuss your crisis in the morning." I watched Preston's jaw clench. He was used to bulldozing people with loud financial jargon and aggressive body language, but he had absolutely no leverage here. He snatched his briefcase off the table, muttering under his breath about blue-collar ignorance. Patricia huffed her way up the grand staircase loudly, complaining about the freezing rain and demanding to know if our guest linens were at least Egyptian cotton. Chelsea trailed behind her, still holding her glass of tap water, as if it contained a toxic substance. Luke and I exchanged a single sharp look. We did not need to speak. We knew exactly what we were going to do. The next morning I woke up at 6 to prepare breakfast for Leo, before his driver arrived to take him to his private academy. When I walked into my custom chef's kitchen, Patricia and Chelsea were already there, treating my home like a complimentary hotel buffet. Chelsea was pulling out imported artisanal cheeses and expensive organic fruits, leaving containers open on the white marble island. Patricia had taken it upon herself to start criticizing my choice of espresso machine, to the empty room loudly declaring that Richard had a much better commercial-grade model imported from Italy at their estate. When Leo came downstairs carrying his backpack and wearing his prep school blazer, Patricia immediately set her sights on him. She did not hug him. She did not ask how he was doing or what his favorite subject was. She pointed a manicured finger directly at his chest. "You need to make sure you keep your grades up, young man," Patricia lectured, her tone dripping with unearned superiority. "You do not want to end up going to a trade school and working a dirty blue-collar job like your father. Connecting wires all day has no future. If you work hard and actually apply yourself, maybe your Uncle Preston can get you an unpaid internship in wealth management so you can learn how real money is made." Leo did not get angry. He inherited his father's quiet, devastating composure. He simply poured himself a glass of fresh orange juice, took a deliberate sip, and looked at my mother with a calm, amused expression. "Grandma," Leo said, his voice perfectly polite, "do you know how the radiant floor heating you complained was too warm last night actually works? The central control grid for this entire neighborhood, and actually the municipal contracts for the entire state, were engineered and installed by my dad's company. He does not just connect wires, he owns the grid." Patricia froze, her coffee cup hovering halfway to her lips. She stared at my 14-year-old son as if he had just spoken an alien language. Chelsea immediately waved her hand in the air, dismissing the claim with a harsh barking scoff. "Oh, please," Chelsea sneered, tossing a piece of cheese onto her plate. "Your father probably fixed a fuse box at the community center and told you he designed the grid." Kids always exaggerate what their parents do. Let us not inflate a local maintenance job into a corporate empire. Preston manages portfolios worth millions. That is what real success looks like. Leo just smiled, picked up his backpack, kissed my cheek, and walked out the door to his waiting car. I did not correct Chelsea. I wanted them to remain completely blind to reality for just a little longer. After breakfast, while I was upstairs dressing for the day and Patricia was complaining about the water pressure in the guest bathroom, Preston decided to take a self-guided tour of our home. He slipped into Luke's home office on the ground floor. I watched him on my phone's secure camera feed as I sat at my vanity. Preston began rifling through the papers on Luke's massive oak desk. He had no boundaries and no respect for privacy. He picked up a thick-bound folder sitting near the keyboard. It was a preliminary summary for a $30 million federal infrastructure contract. I watched the color completely drain from Preston's face on the high-definition monitor as he flipped through the pages. He saw the company name, the massive revenue projections, and the signature line clearly labeling Luke as the chief executive officer of a commercial electrical contracting corporation that operated across 3 time zones. Preston dropped the folder onto the desk like it was actively burning him. He frantically opened another document lying nearby. It was a quarterly tax summary showing liquid assets that dwarfed Richard's entire investment fund even before the FBI seized it. Preston scrambled out of the office, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate kind of greed. I walked out to the upstairs landing just in time to look down and see him pulling Chelsea into the hallway pantry, pulling the door mostly shut behind them. I moved silently to the top of the stairs, listening. "They are loaded!" Preston hissed, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Chelsea, I am not talking about a paid-off mortgage and a nice savings account. I am talking about tens of millions in liquid capital. That idiot tradesman owns a commercial empire. If we can get them to float capital into a trust, we do not just bail out your dad. We can siphon off enough to wipe out my margin calls, pay off the SEC fines I have been hiding, and save my cars from repossession." Chelsea gasped, not in horror at her husband's deceit, but in pure, unadulterated excitement. "We can take it," Chelsea whispered back rapidly. "Gemma is clueless. She got pregnant at 20 and has been playing housewife ever since. There is no way she understands corporate finance or shell structures. We just need to play nice and get them to transfer the funds today. We will tell them it is an emergency high-yield bond for Dad." They stepped out of the pantry, adjusting their clothes and plastering fake friendly smiles onto their faces. I quietly retreated to my bedroom, my heart steady and cold. They thought I was a naive teenage mother who had stumbled into money. They did not know that I was the chief operating officer of that exact empire and that I personally oversaw the legal and financial compliance of every single contract we signed. Later that morning, Preston initiated the next phase of his pathetic scam. He approached Luke on the back patio. Luke was enjoying a cup of black coffee, looking out over the landscaped gardens that backed up to a private forest reserve. Preston sidled up to him, adopting a completely different demeanor than the arrogant finance bro from the night before. "Listen, Luke. I was a little harsh yesterday." Preston began deploying his slickest, most artificial salesman's smile. Emotions were running high with the raid and everything. "But I have been thinking. Instead of leveraging your house, which I know is a big scary step for a working guy, I have a much better financial strategy that actually benefits you in the long run." Luke took a slow sip of his coffee. "I am listening." Preston leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially, playing the part of the helpful insider giving a hot tip. "With the kind of business you are running, you must be getting absolutely hammered by capital gains and corporate tax rates. I run a specialized wealth management firm. If you invest $5 million into a specialized offshore trust that my LLC manages, we can legally shield your revenue from the IRS. It is a completely legitimate tax shelter. I use a fraction of that liquidity to post a federal bond for Richard, and the rest sits in the trust generating a massive tax-free yield for you. It is a win-win scenario." What Preston was describing was a blatant shell company fraud. It was a black hole designed to swallow our money so he could launder it to pay his own massive debts and rescue my father's failing criminal enterprise. Luke looked at Preston, his face a perfect, unreadable mask of working-class humility. $5 million is a lot of money, Preston. I just run the crews and handle the electrical specs. I do not really understand all these trusts and yields and tax shelters you are talking about." Preston's eyes gleamed with predatory delight. He thought he had hooked a massive, clueless fish. "That is exactly why you need a guy like me in your corner, Luke. I handle the complicated stuff. You just provide the capital and I make sure you get richer while helping out the family." Luke scratched his chin, playing the part flawlessly. "Well, you would have to run it by Gemma. I hand my paycheck over to her and she pays all the bills. She is the one who handles the household money. If you can convince her to sign the transfer, you have a deal." Preston actually chuckled, a patronizing, victorious sound that made my blood run cold from where I was listening just inside the patio doors. He patted Luke on the shoulder firmly. "Leave Gemma to me. I will explain it so simply, even she will understand." I knew they were not going to give up. Narcissists never retreat when they believe they are entitled to someone else's resources. They simply change their tactics. Early Wednesday morning, long before the parasites in my guest wing woke up Luke, and I were already out the door. We drove downtown in absolute silence, the anticipation humming between us. We were not heading to a bank to beg for a second mortgage. We were heading to the top floor of the most prestigious corporate law firm in the city, where a team of asset liquidation specialists was waiting for us. We sat across from a senior partner specializing in distressed assets and federal seizures. Richard's world was collapsing much faster than Patricia or Chelsea realized. To satisfy his massive bail requirements and the immediate fines levied by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the federal court had ordered an emergency liquidation of his tangible assets. His sprawling suburban estate, his massive investment portfolios, and even the supposedly secure trusts he used to fund Preston's luxury lifestyle were all quietly being placed on the auction block to appease institutional creditors. Through a blind holding company, an LLC that Luke and I controlled entirely, we purchased all of it. We bought Richard's debt for pennies on the dollar. We bought the deed to the mansion. We even bought the holding company that owned the financing on Preston's luxury vehicles. By Thursday morning, the transaction would be finalized. We would be their sole legal creditors. They literally belonged to us. While we were securing our financial checkmate downtown, Preston was busy digging his own grave back at my house. I received a silent notification on my phone as I sat in the law office. The security software on my home office laptop had been triggered. I pulled up the live feed. There was Preston sweating nervously, frantically inserting a flash drive into my computer. I had anticipated this exact maneuver. The night before, I had deliberately placed a folder labeled Confidential Tax Summaries directly on the desktop. It contained nothing but dummy files and highly complex, entirely legal corporate restructuring plans that looked intimidating to an amateur but were completely useless as blackmail material. Preston excitedly downloaded every single file, grinning like he had just cracked the code to the Federal Reserve. He texted Chelsea immediately, completely unaware that I was watching him commit corporate espionage on a high-definition live stream. He thought he was securing the ultimate leverage for Friday's meeting. In reality, he was just handing me the final nail for his coffin. I saved the video footage directly to my legal counsel's server. Thursday night, the eve of our scheduled meeting, solidified my absolute lack of mercy. I was in the master suite reviewing the final legal binders when I decided to check the audio logs from the hidden security cameras in the guest wing corridors. What I heard extinguished any tiny lingering flicker of daughterly guilt I might have harbored. Patricia was pacing the hallway, speaking on her cell phone with Richard, who had managed to secure a monitored line from his holding facility. Her voice, stripped of its performative sweetness, was sharp and vicious. "Do not worry, Richard," Patricia hissed into the receiver. "Preston has all their financial data. We are going to bleed that electrician dry. As soon as the wire transfer clears and your bond is posted, we are changing the locks on the estate and kicking that ungrateful little brat right back onto the street where she belongs. I should have made her get rid of that baby 15 years ago. She is nothing but white trash, and trash is always trash." I paused the recording. I listened to my own mother refer to my brilliant, kind-hearted son as a mistake and call me trash while actively plotting to steal my wealth and render me homeless. I saved the audio file, backed it up to a secure cloud server, and closed my laptop. My mother had just given me the ultimate gift: absolute clarity. There would be no hesitation tomorrow. Friday afternoon arrived with crisp, bitter clarity. The meeting was set for 2 in the afternoon at a premium executive suite in the financial district. What my family did not know was that Luke's corporation had entirely wired and constructed this Class A building, and we retained permanent access to its executive boardroom. Luke and I arrived early, sitting at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a sweeping view of the city skyline. At exactly 2 o'clock, the double doors swung open. They walked in like royalty arriving to collect their taxes. Richard, having just been released on temporary bail, using the last dregs of his frozen liquidity, led the pack. He looked exhausted, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame, but his arrogant swagger remained intact. Patricia and Chelsea followed, draped in designer labels and dripping with diamonds, completely oblivious to the fact that their jewelry was essentially collateral for federal fines. Preston brought up the rear, carrying his leather briefcase, and accompanied by a sleazy, fast-talking attorney he had likely hired on a desperate contingency basis. They took their seats opposite us, fanning out their paperwork with exaggerated importance. The air in the room was thick with their unwarranted confidence. They were absolutely certain they were about to walk out of this room as millionaires. "All right," Richard said, slamming his hands flat on the mahogany table. "I do not have time for pleasantries. My legal fees are mounting by the hour. Preston, give them the transfer documents. I want this done today so we can get back to our lives." Preston puffed out his chest and slid a thick stack of papers across the table toward Luke and me. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms behind his head with a smug, self-satisfied grin. "Sign on the dotted line," Gemma Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And do not even think about trying to negotiate the terms. I took a little peek at your corporate server yesterday. I know exactly how much cash you are hiding in those offshore tax shelters. If you do not sign over executive control of the company to me right now, my lawyer here is going to forward all that lovely data directly to the Internal Revenue Service. You will be facing federal audits before dinner time." Chelsea smirked, applying a fresh coat of lip gloss. "Just do what you are told for once in your life, Gemma. You owe us this." I did not touch the paperwork. I did not look at the sleazy attorney. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out a small silver remote, and pressed a single button. The heavy mechanical blinds on the glass walls smoothly descended, sealing the room in total privacy. A large digital projector screen descended from the ceiling directly behind my head. "I think there has been a slight misunderstanding about who is being audited today," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I tapped my tablet. The projector screen flared to life, playing the high-definition security footage of Preston sneaking into my home office, aggressively plugging a flash drive into my computer, and stealing files. The date and timestamp were clearly visible in the bottom corner. Preston's smug smile instantly vanished. The color completely drained from his face. His sleazy lawyer sat up straight, his eyes widening in pure legal terror as he realized his client had just confessed to felony corporate espionage on the record. But I was not finished. I tapped the tablet again. The video disappeared, replaced by a black screen displaying a raw audio file. Patricia's voice echoed through the high-end surround sound speakers of the boardroom, crisp and undeniable. "We are going to bleed that electrician dry. As soon as the wire transfer clears, we are kicking that ungrateful little brat right back onto the street. She is nothing but white trash, and trash is always trash." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs right before a fatal car crash. Patricia covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes darting frantically around the room. Chelsea shrank back into her leather chair. Richard stared at his wife, then at me, the reality of the situation finally beginning to pierce his monumental arrogance. Preston's lawyer practically scrambled out of his chair. He began shoving his legal pads back into his briefcase with frantic speed. "I am sorry," the lawyer stammered, holding his hands up in a gesture of total surrender. "I was retained to facilitate a standard corporate transfer. I was not informed that my client obtained financial data through illegal cyber theft, nor was I made aware of a coordinated extortion plot. I am formally withdrawing my representation. Have a good afternoon." The lawyer bolted for the door, practically running out of the room and leaving Preston sitting there with his mouth hanging open. Richard slammed his fist on the table, trying to salvage his crumbling authority. "This is a parlor trick," Richard bellowed, his face turning an angry shade of purple. "You think a secret recording changes anything? You think you can intimidate me? I built a financial empire. If you do not give us the capital we need right now, I will find another investor. I will leverage my estate. I will leverage my cars. I will sell my shares, and I will personally ensure your husband's little contracting business never gets another municipal bid in this state again. Luke finally leaned forward. He rested his elbows on the table, looking at Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. You cannot leverage your estate, Richard Luke said quietly, because you do not own it anymore. I pulled a thick-bound legal folio from my briefcase. The cover bore the red seal of the Federal Bankruptcy Court. I slid it across the mahogany table until it rested directly in front of my father. You needed a massive injection of liquid capital to satisfy the federal courts and keep yourself out of a maximum security cell this week. I explained, my tone surgical and precise. To generate that capital, the courts ordered an emergency liquidation of your distressed assets. Your suburban mansion, your hedge fund shares, the holding company that owns Chelsea's house, and the corporate leases on Preston's precious sports cars. All of it was put on the auction block. Richard stared at the red seal on the folder, his hands beginning to shake. Yesterday morning, I continued a private LLC, purchased every single one of those distressed assets. We bought your debt for pennies on the dollar. Do you want to know who owns that LLC, Richard? I leaned forward, locking eyes with the man who had thrown me away like garbage 15 years ago. The electrician owns it. I own it. We are your sole legal creditors. You do not have a mansion to go back to tonight. You do not have cars. You do not have a trust fund. You have absolutely nothing. We are foreclosing on all of it, effective immediately. Patricia let out a guttural, agonizing wail and collapsed onto the conference table, sobbing hysterically. Chelsea buried her face in her hands, realizing her life of luxury was officially over. Preston sat frozen, staring blankly at the wall as the reality of his impending bankruptcy and potential criminal charges set in. Richard looked like he had been physically struck. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw breath. You cannot do this, he wheezed, his voice stripped of all its former power. We are your family. You cannot just leave us with nothing. Where are we supposed to go? I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored jacket. When I was 20 years old and carrying my child, I asked you that exact same question. I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. You told me that my choices were an embarrassment, and that I was no longer your problem. You threw my suitcase into the rain and locked the door. I picked up my briefcase and turned toward the exit. The building's security guards will escort you out, I said over my shoulder. Your luggage has already been removed from my guest wing and placed on the curb. Do not ever contact me or my family again. Luke and I walked out of the boardroom, leaving them sitting in the ruins of their own arrogance. We did not look back. That evening, as the sun set over our beautiful estate, Luke, Leo, and I sat on the back patio. We grilled steaks, laughed about Leo's upcoming science project, and enjoyed the quiet, unbreakable peace of a family built on actual love and mutual respect. I deleted their contact numbers from my phone permanently. The ghosts of my past had finally been laid to rest, and my future had never looked brighter. I stood just inside the sliding glass doors, watching Preston march back into the house with that repulsive, unearned smirk plastered across his face. He truly believed he had outsmarted us. He thought setting his pathetic financial trap was the hard part, entirely convinced that my husband was nothing more than a gullible laborer. He had no idea the jaws of our own trap were already snapping shut around him. Before Preston could even attempt to corner me with his fraudulent tax shelter pitch, a shrill ring pierced the tense atmosphere of my kitchen. Patricia had left her phone resting on the massive marble island. The caller ID flashed with the name of a high-profile, white-collar criminal defense attorney from downtown. Patricia practically dove across the kitchen, her manicured claws snatching the device. She fumbled with the screen in her panic and slammed her finger onto the speaker button, ensuring the audio would broadcast through the room. Richard's voice barked through the phone speaker. He did not sound like a disgraced man currently sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in a penitentiary for defrauding innocent investors. He sounded exactly like the tyrannical, arrogant hedge fund manager who had terrorized my entire childhood. He sounded like a man who still believed he owned the world and everyone in it. Gemma, get over here right now where I can hear you, Richard commanded. His tone was absolute, expecting immediate unquestioning compliance, just as he had 15 years ago. I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms over my chest. Luke stepped up to stand right beside me, a silent, immovable pillar of support. I did not move closer to the phone. I am here, Richard, I said, my voice dangerously soft and perfectly level. State your business. Listen to me very carefully, my father began, his voice dripping with condescending authority. The SEC is tearing apart my firm. It is a completely baseless witch hunt, but the feds have temporarily frozen the corporate accounts and put a hard hold on all our personal liquidity. Preston tells me your husband somehow stumbled into some serious capital. He tells me Luke is sitting on a commercial contracting business with federal ties and municipal contracts. That is a highly sensitive sector. He paused, likely expecting me to gasp in awe at his profound financial wisdom. When I remained dead silent, he continued, his tone growing even more patronizing. A guy who twists wires for a living does not have the intellectual capacity or the pedigree to manage tens of millions of dollars without triggering an audit, Richard sneered. Your husband is going to end up in federal crosshairs himself if he is not careful. You are the older sister, Gemma. You have a responsibility to this family. You are going to have your lawyer draft a transfer of executive control today. You are going to sign over temporary proxy of Luke's corporation to Preston. Preston will consolidate your assets, shield them under his wealth management firm, and generate the capital to bail me out and fight these ridiculous charges. Once I am clear of this mess, we will restructure your husband's little business so it actually operates efficiently. Do not argue with me on this. Get the paperwork started right now. I stared at the phone sitting on the marble counter. The sheer, unadulterated delusion was breathtaking. A man sitting in federal custody for severe securities fraud was demanding that I hand over control of a perfectly clean, highly profitable multi-million-dollar corporation to his equally fraudulent, debt-ridden son-in-law. He truly believed that because Luke wore a tool belt in his 20s, he was mentally inferior to men who wore tailored suits and stole from pension funds. Richard. I said, my words slicing through the kitchen like shattered glass. Let me make this abundantly clear so even you can understand it from inside your holding cell. You will not see a single cent of our money. You will not get a proxy, a loan, a leveraged asset, or a handout. If you think I am going to let Preston anywhere near my husband's company, the federal air in that facility has completely rotted your brain. You are a criminal facing federal indictment, and you have the audacity to demand my hard-earned assets to save your own skin. Do not ever call my house with demands again. There was a heavy, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then Richard exploded. You insolent, ungrateful little brat! He roared, his voice distorting through the small speaker. I am your father. You owe me your life. You think because you married some dirty tradesman who got lucky with a few contracts that you are better than me. I will destroy you. I will make sure. A loud buzz interrupted his rant, followed by the automated voice of the correctional facility operator stating that the allotted time for the call had expired. The line went dead. For 2 seconds, the kitchen was blissfully quiet. Then Patricia unleashed a shriek that rattled the pendant lights hanging above the island. It was a visceral, high-pitched sound of pure manufactured agony. She slammed her hands down on the countertop, glaring at me with a hatred so deep it was almost tangible. Then, recognizing that anger would not work against my cold logic, she immediately pivoted to her favorite weapon. She shifted seamlessly into the role of the ultimate victim. Patricia crumpled to her knees right there on the heated hardwood floor. She buried her face in her hands and began to wail, forcing loud, heaving sobs that echoed through the entire first floor of my home. How could you? Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with theatrical devastation. How could you be so cold-blooded? That is your father, Gemma. Your own flesh and blood. He is sitting in a cage like an animal, and you are standing there refusing to throw him a life preserver. You are a monster. You are watching your own family bleed to death, and you will not even lift a finger to save us. Chelsea immediately rushed to her mother's side, kneeling on the floor and wrapping her arms around Patricia's shaking shoulders. Chelsea glared up at me, her eyes flashing with venom. "You are sick, Gemma." Chelsea spat, her face twisting into a nasty snarl. "You have always been jealous of this family. You are just doing this to punish Dad because he rightfully kicked you out when you disgraced us. You are holding on to a pathetic 15-year-old grudge while Dad is suffering. You have the power to fix this right now with a single signature, but you are too selfish to do what is right." I looked down at the two women sobbing on my kitchen floor. I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sorrow, no residual obligation. I just felt a profound sense of exhaustion at their endless, exhausting theatrics. "Blood is thicker than water," Patricia wailed, clutching her chest, as if she were experiencing physical heart failure. "After everything we sacrificed for you, we gave you a beautiful childhood. We provided a roof over your head. We tried to protect you from ruining your life with that blue-collar loser. And this is how you repay us. You are dead inside." I stepped away from the counter and looked down at my mother. "You declared me dead 15 years ago, Patricia," I replied, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. "Do not act like you are grieving a loss now, just because my corpse suddenly happens to have a healthy bank account." Patricia gasped, placing a dramatic hand over her mouth. "You have no heart. I carried you for 9 months. I went through agonizing labor to bring you into this world. A daughter is supposed to honor her parents. You are abandoning your own blood. You abandoned me in the pouring rain," I reminded her, refusing to let her rewrite history. "I was 20 years old. I was terrified. I was carrying your grandson. You stood on the porch and told me I was a filthy mistake. You told me my child would be nothing but a burden. You did not care if I starved on the streets. You did not care if I froze. You only cared what your snobby country club friends would think about your pregnant daughter dating a man who worked for a living. So do not kneel in my custom kitchen inside the fortress that my incredible blue-collar husband built for me and preach to me about the sanctity of family." Patricia sobbed louder, rocking back and forth. "You are killing your father. The stress is going to give him a heart attack and his blood will be on your hands. If Richard has a heart attack, it will be because he stole millions of dollars from innocent people, and the federal government finally caught him," Luke interjected quietly. His voice was deep, resonant, and completely immovable. "We did not commit securities fraud. We did not lie to investors. Your husband dug his own grave. Do not try to hand Gemma the shovel." Preston, who had been standing silently near the refrigerator, finally puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his crumbling scheme. "Listen, Gemma, you are letting emotions cloud your financial judgment. You are acting hysterical. If you just let me step in as proxy, I can shield Luke's assets while we sort out Richard's mess. It is just business." I turned my gaze to Preston. "You are not a businessman, Preston. You are a parasite looking for a new host because your current one just got raided by the FBI. I know exactly what your fake proxy transfer is designed to do. You want to siphon our liquidity to pay off your own failing margins. It will not happen. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." I looked back down at Patricia and Chelsea, who were still clinging to each other on the floor. "Keep crying if it makes you feel better," I said, turning my back on them. "But do it quietly. I have actual work to do." I walked out of the kitchen, Luke right beside me, leaving their desperate, pathetic wails echoing off the marble countertops. They had tried to break me with guilt, but they failed to realize one crucial fact. You cannot guilt-trip a woman who has already mourned the loss of her parents a decade and a half ago. The very next afternoon, I returned home from a brief meeting at our corporate headquarters to find my private circular driveway completely choked with high-end luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts were rushing back and forth, parking sports cars and sleek sedans along the manicured edges of my property. I stepped out of my vehicle, handing my keys to a confused valet who clearly did not recognize the actual owner of the estate he was currently working at. The heavy, savory scent of grilled meats and expensive cigars drifted through the crisp afternoon air originating from the expansive backyard. I walked through my own front doors to find my house transformed into a high-society networking event. Chelsea had taken it upon herself to orchestrate a desperate, full-blown public relations maneuver. Without asking for permission, without even a shred of common decency, she had invited several of Richard's former business partners, prominent investors, and influential board members to my home for an impromptu barbecue. Her strategy was incredibly transparent. The news of the FBI raid and the SEC freezing Richard's assets was already spreading through the financial district like wildfire. These investors were sharks circling the bloody water, trying to determine if Richard's downfall was going to drag their own portfolios down with him. Chelsea was trying to project an illusion of total, unshakable financial stability. By hosting these wealthy, influential people at a sprawling, high-tech estate, she wanted them to believe the family was completely unaffected by the federal indictments. She was actively using the sheer scale and luxury of my home to gaslight my father's business associates into believing that the family wealth was still firmly intact. I walked slowly through the house and stepped out onto the massive stone patio. The sight was infuriatingly predictable. Chelsea had hired a private catering staff to serve imported Wagyu beef, fresh seafood, and top-shelf cocktails, charging it all to a credit card that Preston had likely maxed out hours ago. Patricia was sitting elegantly under a custom cabana, sipping a mimosa and laughing with forced brittle brightness as she assured a nervous investor that the federal investigation was nothing more than a minor administrative mix-up. Preston was working the crowd near the outdoor bar, sweating through his designer shirt as he frantically tried to pitch his wealth management services to men who were clearly trying to distance themselves from him. Luke stepped out onto the patio right behind me. He had been working in his home office all morning negotiating a massive supply chain contract for our upcoming municipal grid project. He was dressed casually, wearing fitted dark jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. He looked relaxed, completely unbothered by the invasion of high society snobs occupying our private sanctuary. He walked over to the outdoor kitchen, completely ignoring Preston's frantic networking, and poured himself a glass of sparkling water. Chelsea spotted Luke, and her eyes immediately lit up with malicious, calculated intent. She saw a golden opportunity to establish her dominance and validate her fabricated narrative in front of Richard's wealthy friends. She needed to prove to these investors that she was the lady of the manor, the wealthy heiress generously hosting them at her family estate. To do that, she needed a prop. She needed someone she could publicly degrade to elevate her own status. She chose my husband. Chelsea marched over to the center of the patio, projecting her voice so the entire crowd could hear her over the soft jazz playing through the outdoor speakers. Luke, Chelsea called out, snapping her fingers at him like he was a disobedient stray dog. The water pressure on the patio misters is incredibly weak today, and the faucet near the rose bushes is dripping all over the imported stone. My guests are getting too warm. Grab your little tool belt and go figure out the plumbing right now. The casual conversation on the patio instantly died down. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. Several of the wealthy investors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging awkward sideways glances. They were waiting to see how the hired help would react to being publicly dressed down by the demanding hostess. Chelsea placed her hands on her hips, her lips curling into a nasty, venomous smirk. "You are the family maintenance man, after all," she continued, her voice dripping with toxic condescension. "That is your specialty, right? Fixing the dirty things the rest of us do not want to touch. Go on, Luke. Do the one thing you are actually good at, so my guests can enjoy their afternoon in peace." I felt a spike of cold fury rise in my chest, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. I looked at Luke. I knew he did not need me to defend him. Luke did not flush with embarrassment. He did not raise his voice, and he certainly did not look intimidated by the sea of wealthy investors staring at him. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his sparkling water and offered Chelsea a bright, devastatingly polite smile. "Of course, Chelsea," Luke said easily, his voice smooth and entirely unbothered. "Let me get the maintenance crew on that right away." Luke pulled his phone from his pocket. He did not walk away to make the call in private. He stood right there in the center of the patio, pressed a single button on his speed dial, and held the phone to his ear. He spoke quietly into the receiver for exactly 10 seconds, gave a brief nod, and ended the call. He slid the phone back into his pocket and returned to sipping his water, leaning casually against the stone counter of the outdoor kitchen. Chelsea smirked, turning back to her guests with a triumphant hair flip. She was clearly satisfied that she had put the tradesman back in his proper place. She began loudly discussing her upcoming vacation plans to a captive audience of nervous bankers eager to maintain the illusion of her supremacy. Exactly 5 minutes later, the heavy iron side gates of the estate swung open with a loud mechanical hum. The sound drew the attention of everyone on the patio. A massive branded commercial utility van and two pristine heavy-duty golf carts drove onto the property, pulling to a neat stop near the edge of the manicured lawn. The logo on the side of the vehicles was instantly recognizable to anyone who did business in this state. It was the premier commercial facility management firm in the region. 4 men in professional matching uniforms stepped out of the vehicles. They were the dedicated private maintenance crew for our specific ultra-exclusive zip code, a highly lucrative subsidiary company that Luke's corporation owned a majority stake in. The lead supervisor, a burly no-nonsense man holding a digital tablet, walked briskly across the lawn. He walked directly past Chelsea, completely ignoring her indignant gasp as he brushed by her designer dress. He stopped squarely in front of Luke, stood up straight, and extended his hand with the utmost professional respect. "Mr. CEO," the supervisor said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent patio. "We received your direct priority call. What needs fixing on the estate today, sir?" The silence that fell over the backyard was absolute. It was deafening. The wealthy investors, men and women who spent their entire lives analyzing power dynamics and sniffing out wealth, stared at Luke. Their eyes widened as they rapidly processed the interaction they had just witnessed. They looked at the massive, sprawling mansion behind them. They looked at the commercial fleet of vehicles that had arrived at his beck and call in under 5 minutes. They looked at the sheer, undeniable deference the supervisor showed to the man in the plain t-shirt. Then, as if functioning as a single collective mind, the investors slowly turned their gaze toward Chelsea. The pieces finally clicked together in their calculating brains. They realized the horrific, embarrassing truth. Chelsea was not the wealthy, powerful hostess graciously entertaining them at her family estate. Chelsea was a broke, desperate, lying squatter attempting to throw a party in the home of the very billionaire she had just tried to humiliate. A low collective murmur rippled through the crowd. I watched one prominent investor lean over and whisper to his colleague, shaking his head in absolute disgust as he stared at Patricia and Chelsea. Another woman set her cocktail down on a nearby table, quietly signaling to her husband that it was time to leave. The illusion was completely shattered. The facade had been violently ripped away. Chelsea's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. Her jaw worked furiously, opening and closing like a suffocating fish, as she realized her entire narrative had just been dismantled with a single polite phone call. She looked frantically at the investors, trying to formulate a lie to cover the disaster, but they were already turning their backs on her, thoroughly repulsed by the pathetic display of fake wealth and unearned arrogance. Patricia shrank back into her cabana, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Preston suddenly found his shoes incredibly fascinating, refusing to make eye contact with any of the bankers he had been desperately trying to impress just moments ago. Luke calmly pointed toward the rose bushes. "There is a slight drip on the secondary irrigation line over there," Luke told the supervisor, his tone friendly and appreciative. "And go ahead and check the pressure on the patio meisters while you are at it. I want to make sure my wife's uninvited guests are completely comfortable before they are escorted off my property." "Understood perfectly, sir," the supervisor replied with a sharp nod. "We will have it handled immediately." Luke turned his gaze back to Chelsea. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, cornered panic. He offered her one last polite smile before walking across the patio to stand beside me. We watched together as the maintenance crew efficiently went to work, entirely ignoring the humiliated, silent family that was currently drowning in their own manufactured disgrace. The party was officially over, and everyone in the yard knew exactly who held the power. The valets could barely keep up with the sudden, frantic demand for vehicles. The wealthy investors, desperate to distance themselves from the stench of Richard's collapsing financial empire and Chelsea's profound public humiliation, practically sprinted toward my circular driveway. Car doors slammed heavily. Engines roared to life. Within 10 minutes, the sprawling backyard was entirely deserted save for the private caterers, who were awkwardly packing away untouched Wagyu beef and dismantling the expensive cocktail stations. Chelsea stood frozen in the center of the patio, watching her desperate networking event dissolve into a catastrophic public relations nightmare. The artificial high society mask she had worn her entire life finally slipped off, shattering into a million jagged pieces on the imported stone pavers. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She spun around, her eyes locking onto me with the manic intensity of a cornered animal. She stomped across the patio, her designer heels clicking sharply. She grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by frantic adrenaline and total embarrassment. I did not pull away. I wanted to see exactly how far she was willing to escalate this disaster. She dragged me roughly through the sliding glass doors past the silent kitchen and shoved me into my private library, slamming the heavy mahogany doors shut behind us. The heavy doors sealed out all ambient sound, plunging the room into a tense, suffocating quiet. Chelsea whirled around to face me. She was panting, her chest heaving, the perfect blowout of her hair now a frizzy, chaotic mess around her shoulders. "You think you are so brilliant," Chelsea hissed, her voice vibrating with raw hatred. "You think you can humiliate me in front of Dad's associates and just walk away? You are nothing, Gemma. You are just a disappointment who got knocked up by a tradesman. You got lucky. You rode his coattails into this house, and now you think you hold all the cards." I leaned back against the edge of a massive bookshelf, my expression perfectly neutral. I let her vent her toxic insecurity. It was like watching a toddler throw a violent tantrum because someone took away a toy they had stolen in the first place. "If you do not force Luke to sign that corporate proxy over to Preston by Friday," Chelsea threatened, jabbing a manicured finger at my chest, "Dad is going to destroy you. He is going to call the corporate board of directors at your husband's company. He is going to call the municipal licensing offices, the local news stations, and all your high-profile clients. He is going to remind them all about your felony criminal record." The words hung in the quiet library air. A felony criminal record. It was the darkest, most carefully guarded secret of my past, a heavy, suffocating chain that my family had locked around my neck 16 years ago. I was 19 years old. Chelsea was 16. She had stolen Richard's luxury sedan for a midnight joyride while she was heavily intoxicated and high on cocaine. I had been sitting in the passenger seat, having spent the entire night begging her to pull over and let me drive before she killed someone. When the police sirens flashed red and blue in the rearview mirror, Chelsea had suffered a hysterical breakdown. The police found a substantial bag of cocaine stuffed inside her designer clutch on the center console. Richard and Patricia had arrived at the police precinct not to comfort their daughters, but to protect their most valuable asset. They pulled me into a cold, concrete interrogation room. I could still remember the sharp, sterile smell of the police station and the absolute ice in my father's eyes as he looked at me. "Chelsea is going to a prestigious university," Richard had told me, his voice completely devoid of any parental warmth. "She has a pristine future. You are already a massive disappointment. You are dating an electrician. You have absolutely no prospects. If you do not claim those drugs are yours, Gemma, I will cut off every cent of your college tuition. I will kick you out of my house, and I will make sure you end up sleeping on the streets. Take the charge." They manipulated, threatened, and coerced me until I broke. I took the plea deal. I accepted the probation, the grueling community service, and the permanent ugly stain of a drug conviction on my background check so the golden child could keep her shiny, perfect future intact. It was an agonizing burden that I had to fight tooth and nail to overcome as I climbed the corporate ladder in the electrical contracting industry. I had spent countless hours in legal offices obtaining expungement waivers just to be able to sign municipal contracts. And now, after sacrificing my own clean record to save her life, she was using that exact same sacrifice to blackmail me. The sheer breathtaking evil of her threat washed over me, but it did not make me crumble. It made me absolutely invincible. "You are going to sign the papers," Gemma Chelsea spat, taking a step closer, completely misinterpreting my silence as fear. "Because if Dad leaks that file, Your board of directors will remove you by Monday morning. Your municipal contracts require clean executive background checks. Your entire empire will burn to the ground. You will lose everything you and your husband built all because you refuse to help your own family. I looked at her. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I slowly raised my left hand and tapped the face of my smartwatch twice. The screen briefly illuminated, confirming that the high-fidelity voice recording application had successfully activated. It was a habit I had developed in the corporate world when dealing with hostile negotiations, and it was about to pay off in the most spectacular way imaginable. You mean the felony record for the cocaine that was inside your designer purse? I asked, my voice smooth, deliberate, and perfectly articulate, ensuring every syllable was captured clearly by the microphone on my wrist. The cocaine you were high on when you were driving underage. The felony our parents forced me to take so you would not lose your university admission. Chelsea let out a sharp, cruel laugh, entirely unaware that her confession was currently being digitized and saved to a secure cloud server. Nobody cares whose it actually was. Gemma Chelsea bragged, a nasty sneer returning to her face. The court records have your name on them. You are the convicted felon. I am the spotless, perfect daughter. The truth does not matter in the real world. Only the paperwork matters. You are going to sign Preston's contract, or we are going to ruin you. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that finally made Chelsea take a hesitant step backward. She expected me to beg. She expected me to fall to my knees and plead for my reputation. Instead, she had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy her blackmail attempt and potentially reopen a 16-year-old case of judicial fraud. She had just confessed to a felony and to a coordinated extortion plot on a crystal-clear audio file. Go ahead and try, I replied gently, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Try me. I walked out of the wine cellar, leaving Chelsea standing alone in the cold, and immediately went to find Luke. The rest of the afternoon passed with a tense, suffocating atmosphere settling over the estate. I retreated to my home office to finalize the massive asset acquisition with our legal team downtown, ensuring that every single one of Richard's liquidated properties and Preston's debt obligations were securely transferred into our holding company. While I was securing our absolute dominance on paper, the parasites occupying my guest wing were busy trying to salvage their shattered egos. Despite the catastrophic public humiliation at the afternoon barbecue, Patricia insisted on hosting a formal family dinner that evening. She commandeered my custom chef's kitchen barking orders at the remaining private catering staff, as if she were paying their exorbitant hourly rates. She instructed them to serve the leftover Wagyu beef and imported seafood on my finest bone china in the formal dining room. She was desperately trying to reassert her dominance, treating my house as her personal kingdom, to mask the terrifying reality that she was entirely broke and her husband was sitting in a federal holding cell. Luke and I joined them at the massive oak dining table purely to observe their delusion in real time. Leo was safely upstairs, having wisely opted to eat his dinner in the media room rather than endure his grandmother's toxic grating company. The dining room sparkled under the modern crystal chandelier, but the air was thick with unspoken hostility. Chelsea sat beside her mother, her posture rigid but her eyes gleaming with a sick, triumphant satisfaction. She clearly believed her blackmail attempt in the wine cellar had been a flawless victory. She thought she had me completely trapped. Preston sat across from her, shoveling premium steak into his mouth, his earlier embarrassment on the patio completely erased by the prospect of free luxury dining and the anticipation of stealing our money. Then the true performance began. Patricia raised her wine glass, swirling the expensive vintage she had pilfered from my private cellar without asking. She spoke loudly, intentionally raising her voice to ensure her words carried past the dining table and into the open kitchen where the catering staff were quietly cleaning up. Despite the little misunderstandings with the maintenance staff today, Patricia announced, her voice dripping with artificial syrupy sweetness, I think it is crucial to remember the foundation of family unity. And we must never forget exactly how this beautiful, sprawling home came to be. She gestured expansively around my meticulously designed dining room, waving her manicured hand at the custom architectural details. When Gemma and her tradesman husband were struggling to make ends meet, Richard stepped in. Patricia lied seamlessly. He took his hard-earned money, the massive wealth he bled for in the financial district, and he graciously loaned it to his daughter so she could have a respectable roof over her head. This house, this very table we are eating on the property you are all enjoying is a direct testament to Richard's incredible generosity. He financed all of this so his daughter would not have to live in a dirty blue-collar slum. We gave them this life. I stopped cutting my steak. My knife rested silently against the china plate. I looked at Luke. He did not flush with anger. He did not clench his fists. He just raised a single eyebrow, taking a slow, calm sip of his sparkling water. The sheer, breathtaking magnitude of her lie was staggering. My father had never given me a single dime after throwing me out into the freezing rain 15 years ago. Every brick, every piece of imported stone, every high-end appliance in this fortress was paid for by the sweat, blood, and brilliant corporate acumen of the man sitting next to me. We had built a commercial empire from absolute scratch, navigating brutal municipal contracts and federal bids. Yet Patricia was loudly claiming it was funded by her criminal husband, spinning a fabricated fairy tale to soothe her own bruised ego and repair the shattered illusion of their superiority in front of the hired help. Chelsea immediately chimed in, leaning forward with a vicious, arrogant smirk. Exactly, Mom, Chelsea agreed loudly. People often conveniently forget who actually built the foundation of their lives. It is so easy to act high and mighty, to act like you are completely self-made when you are actually standing on a platform that someone else paid for. It is time to pay that massive debt back to the family. Dad needs his investment returned immediately. That was it. That was the exact moment the last frayed thread of my patience snapped entirely. I had endured their insults, their ridiculous demands, their invasion of my home, and their pathetic extortion attempts. But sitting in the house that my husband built with his own two hands and his brilliant mind listening to these desperate parasites try to steal the credit for his monumental success was the absolute final straw. I dropped my fork onto the plate. The sharp ringing clatter instantly silenced the entire table. The catering staff in the kitchen froze mid-step. I wiped my mouth slowly with a linen napkin, deliberately taking my time to let the heavy silence stretch out. I pushed my heavy dining chair back and stood up at the head of the table. The anger I felt was no longer hot, chaotic, or impulsive. It was absolute, freezing, and surgically precise. I looked directly into Patricia's eyes, then shifted my gaze to Chelsea and finally locked eyes with Preston. "You all want to solve this urgent financial matter, right?" I asked, my voice cutting through the dining room air with deadly clarity. You want to talk about debts, massive corporate loans, and signing over leveraged assets to save Richard from a federal prison sentence. You want access to our liquidity to fix your broken lives. Preston immediately sat up straight, dropping his napkin onto his lap. His greedy, desperate eyes lit up with predatory excitement. He thought I was finally surrendering. "Now you are finally talking sense, Gemma," Preston said rapidly, leaning over his empty plate. "I knew you would eventually come around and see the big picture. We just need to get the corporate proxy paperwork finalized tonight, and I can start moving the capital by morning to shield the assets from the SEC and get Richard out on bond. I will not sign a single document at this dining table." I interrupted my tone, leaving absolutely zero room for debate. If we are doing this, we are doing it properly and legally. This Friday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, we will all meet at my lawyer's office in the financial district. Bring your fraudulent trust documents, Preston. Bring your desperate pleas. Bring whatever you think you need. We will sit in a professional corporate boardroom, and we will sign the papers to determine the final absolute fate of your financial crisis. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the polished oak table, staring them down with an unblinking gaze. "But let me be perfectly clear about one thing," I stated softly. "We are doing this strictly by my rules." The reaction from the parasites was instantaneous and incredibly satisfying in its absolute pathetic delusion. Patricia let out a loud theatrical sigh of relief, pressing a manicured hand to her chest, as if she had just won a grueling, exhausting battle of wills. Her shoulders dropped, completely convinced that her ridiculous monologue about Richard's fake generosity had successfully shamed me into submission. She thought her psychological manipulation had worked perfectly. Chelsea flashed a vicious, triumphant smirk, her eyes gleaming with toxic pride. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. She was thoroughly convinced that her blackmail threat regarding my teenage record in the wine cellar had forced my hand and broken my spirit. She thought she was a strategic mastermind who had just secured her financial future. Preston grabbed his wine glass, rubbing his hands together in pure, unadulterated greed. He was already calculating the massive commissions he would steal, imagining how much of our corporate liquidity he could rapidly siphon off into his own failing accounts to save his repossessed luxury cars and pay off his hidden debts. They looked at each other across my dining table, their faces glowing with arrogant victory. They raised their wine glasses to one another in a silent, mocking toast. They honestly believed they had broken the family scapegoat. They firmly thought they were about to walk out of my life as multimillionaires, having successfully pillaged the wealth of the blue-collar worker they so deeply despised. They had absolutely no idea that I had not just agreed to a negotiation. I had just formally scheduled their corporate execution. Early Wednesday morning, long before the sun even considered rising over the city skyline, Luke and I were already awake, dressed in impeccable business attire, and walking out our front door. We left the parasites snoring loudly in the guest wing, deeply asleep in my premium bedding, completely oblivious to the absolute financial earthquake we were about to trigger. The drive into the downtown financial district was wrapped in a comfortable, focused, and heavily anticipated silence. We were not heading to some desperate local bank branch to beg a loan officer for a second mortgage on our home. We were not scrambling to find liquidity to save a sinking ship. We were heading to the top floor of the most ruthless elite corporate law firm in the state. We stepped out of the private elevator and into a reception area defined by floor-to-ceiling glass-polished marble and the quiet, heavy atmosphere of absolute power. We were expected. We were immediately escorted into a massive executive boardroom overlooking the waking city. Waiting for us was Attorney Davis, a senior partner who specialized exclusively in federal asset seizures, corporate restructuring, and distressed debt liquidation. Attorney Davis did not offer empty pleasantries. He knew exactly who we were and exactly why we were there. He slid 3 massive, heavily bound legal folios across the polished conference table. Richard's world was collapsing much faster and far more violently than Patricia or Chelsea could possibly comprehend. Attorney Davis laid out the stark, brutal reality of my father's situation. The dramatic FBI raid at his estate was merely the opening salvo. The Securities and Exchange Commission, acting in aggressive conjunction with federal prosecutors, had moved with terrifying, unprecedented speed. To satisfy the immediate massive federal fines and secure the mandatory restitution funds for the hundreds of innocent investors Richard had defrauded, the federal courts had ordered an emergency expedited liquidation of his tangible assets. The illusion of wealth that Patricia and Chelsea were so desperately clinging to was already dead. The federal government had seized his sprawling suburban estate, the very same mansion where Patricia had reigned supreme for decades and where Chelsea had grown up spoiled and entitled. They had dismantled the elaborate, shady network of trusts Richard had used to illegally fund Preston's lavish lifestyle. The holding companies that owned the leases to Preston's fleet of high-end European sports cars were frozen. Every single piece of their material existence was quietly being placed on the institutional auction block. The major banks and institutional lenders wanted to clear Richard's highly toxic debt from their ledgers as fast as humanly possible. His name was radioactive. They were offering his assets at a steep, almost insulting discount just to wash their hands of the scandal before the media cycle caught wind of the full extent of the fraud. That is exactly where we stepped in. Over the past 24 hours, while Preston was busy trying to scam us and Chelsea was attempting to blackmail me in my wine cellar, our legal team had activated a blind holding company. It was a completely anonymous, limited liability company, an untraceable corporate entity that Luke and I controlled entirely through our primary corporation. Through this shell company, we did not just make a competitive bid on a fraction of the assets. We bought all of it. We bought Richard's massive debt for literal pennies on the dollar. We bought the physical deed to the sprawling suburban mansion that Patricia loved more than she had ever loved me. We bought the holding company that owned the financing on Preston's luxury vehicles, meaning we now held the direct power to repossess the cars he constantly bragged about. We bought the remains of the shattered investment portfolios. Attorney Davis opened the first folio, pointing a silver pen at the execution line. The banks are highly motivated to close this out today, Gemma Davis said, his voice a low professional murmur. Your father's reputation is entirely destroyed. By executing this purchase agreement, your LLC absorbs the entirety of his defaulted loans and seized properties. You understand the implications of this acquisition, correct? I looked down at the dense legal text. I understood the implications perfectly. By signing these documents, the federal government and the major banks were stepping out of the picture. Luke and I would become their sole legal creditors. My parents, my arrogant sister, and her parasitic husband would owe every single cent of their livelihood directly to us. We would literally own the roof over their heads and the cars in their driveway. Luke leaned forward, reviewing the financial disclosures with the sharp analytical eye of a CEO who managed 9-figure municipal contracts daily. He traced the lines of debt, calculating the exact leverage we were acquiring. He looked up at me, a slow, satisfying smile spreading across his face. Preston offered us a shell company yesterday, Luke said quietly, the irony rich and heavy in the boardroom. He wanted to shield our assets. Instead, we are buying his entirely real, entirely catastrophic debt. I wonder how his wealth management firm will react when they realize a commercial electrician just bought his car loans. I picked up the heavy fountain pen provided by Attorney Davis. I felt no hesitation. I felt no lingering guilt or familial obligation. I thought about the night I stood in the freezing rain, 20 years old, terrified, holding a single suitcase while Patricia locked the heavy mahogany door in my face. I thought about Richard telling me my unborn child was a disgrace. I thought about the 15 years of absolute silence, broken only when they needed a financial lifeboat to save themselves from a federal prison sentence. I signed my name on the first document. The ink flowed smoothly, permanently transferring the deed of my childhood home into my holding company. I signed the second document, absorbing the vehicle leases. I signed the third, taking total, absolute control of their financial ruin. Luke took the pen from my hand and added his signature beside mine, his strong, steady handwriting cementing our joint ownership of their destruction. The wire transfers from our corporate accounts had already been authorized and queued. Attorney Davis checked his secure tablet, watching the digital confirmation roll in from the Federal Clearinghouse. The funds have cleared. Davis announced, closing the folios with a sharp, satisfying snap. The transaction is fully executed. By Thursday morning, the public registry will update, but effectively as of this exact moment, your LLC holds all the leverage. You are the primary lien holders on the estate and the vehicles. What are your instructions regarding the foreclosure proceedings? I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below, feeling a sense of absolute, untouchable power coursing through my veins. I had spent 15 years building myself into a fortress so that nobody could ever hurt me again. Now I was dropping the portcullis on the people who had tried to bury me. Pause all eviction and repossession notices for exactly 48 hours, I instructed Attorney Davis, my voice ringing with cold authority. Let them continue to believe they have a chance to secure leverage. Let them walk into our scheduled meeting on Friday afternoon completely blind to the fact that they no longer own a single asset to their name. Davis offered a rare, sharp smile. Understood perfectly. I will prepare the final foreclosure notices for delivery at the conclusion of your meeting on Friday. Luke and I walked out of the law firm and stepped into the private elevator. As the doors slid shut, sealing us in the quiet mahogany-paneled car, Luke reached over and pulled me into a tight, grounding embrace. He kissed the top of my head, a silent acknowledgement of the massive life-altering shift that had just occurred. We had not just secured our assets. We had not just protected our home from their predatory schemes. We had systematically, legally, and permanently stripped my toxic family of the one thing they valued above all else in this world: their wealth, their status, their leverage. They were currently sitting in my house eating my food and plotting my downfall, entirely unaware that the executioner's switch had already been pulled. The countdown to Friday afternoon had officially begun, and I was going to savor every single second of their impending spectacular collapse. While Luke and I were downtown finalizing the acquisition of their entire financial existence, the parasite infestation currently occupying my home was busy trying to dig their own pathetic, shallow graves. The security alert flashed on my phone just as we were walking out of the law firm's lobby. It was a silent, high-priority notification triggered by the secondary security protocol I had installed on my personal home office laptop. I had anticipated that Preston, fueled by his desperate greed and arrogant overestimation of his own intelligence, would attempt some kind of corporate espionage. He was a cornered rat facing total financial ruin, and cornered rats always make incredibly stupid, predictable mistakes. I opened the secure live feed on my phone and showed the screen to Luke as we walked toward our car. The high-definition camera mounted discreetly above my office doorway provided a crystal-clear view of the room. Preston was hunched over my massive oak desk, sweating profusely through his designer shirt. His eyes darted nervously toward the closed office door every few seconds, terrified of being caught yet completely oblivious to the camera, silently broadcasting his felony in real time. He had bypassed the simple lock screen, a password I had intentionally left written on a sticky note tucked slightly under the keyboard, making it just hidden enough to feel like a genuine discovery to an amateur snooper. Now he was frantically clicking through the files on my desktop. He was not looking for family photos or personal correspondence. He was hunting for corporate blood. The night before, while the rest of the house was sleeping, I had carefully constructed the perfect digital trap. I had created a folder labeled Highly Confidential Corporate Tax Summaries and placed it dead center on the desktop. It was bait so obvious and glittering that an opportunistic bottom feeder like Preston could never resist it. Inside that folder, I had dumped a massive collection of raw, unformatted financial data. There were confusing spreadsheets containing disorganized supply chain invoices, complicated partially redacted municipal bid drafts, and highly complex corporate restructuring plans that our legal team had discarded years ago. To the untrained eye of a desperate, failing wealth manager, the sheer volume and complexity of the documents looked incredibly intimidating. It looked exactly like a company trying to obscure massive profits through convoluted channels. It looked like tax evasion. It looked like the ultimate blackmail material. I watched on the screen as Preston hurriedly pulled a sleek silver flash drive from his pocket and jammed it into the USB port of my laptop. His hands were actually shaking as he highlighted the entire folder and dragged it over to his drive. He was grinning. It was a manic, greedy, repulsive smile. He genuinely thought he had just cracked the vault to a multi-million-dollar empire. He believed he had uncovered the dark, dirty secrets of the blue-collar tradesman and his naive wife. "Look at him," Luke murmured, a low rumble of amusement in his chest, as he unlocked the car. "He is downloading hundreds of pages of outdated wiring schematics and rejected zoning permits. He probably thinks a copper commodity invoice is a money-laundering ledger." "He thinks he just won the lottery," I replied, sliding into the passenger seat and keeping my eyes locked on the live feed. "He is going to use those files to threaten me on Friday. He thinks he has the leverage to force me to sign over the corporate proxy." On the screen, the transfer completed. Preston snatched the flash drive from the port, shoved it deep into his pocket, and practically sprinted out of my office, making sure to pull the door shut with exaggerated care so it appeared untouched. What Preston did not realize, and what made the trap absolutely flawless, was the metadata embedded deep within those files. Our corporate IT department had tagged every single document in that dummy folder with tracking beacons. The moment Preston opened those files on an external device or forwarded them through an unsecured server, our system would instantly flag the breached document, the IP address, and log the exact time and destination of the data transfer. He was not just stealing useless paperwork. He was generating a perfectly documented, legally binding trail of corporate espionage and data theft. He was handing me the rope he intended to hang himself with. The confirmation of his spectacular stupidity arrived less than an hour later as Luke and I were driving back to the estate. My phone buzzed with an automated alert from our corporate IT director. The stolen files had been accessed on an external laptop and immediately transmitted via email. I forwarded the log to Attorney Davis, who responded within 2 minutes. The IP address Preston had sent the files to belonged to a mid-tier defense attorney in the city. Preston was so desperate and so utterly confident in his stolen leverage that he had immediately blasted the raw data to his legal counsel to prepare his extortion demands for our Friday meeting. He was building his blackmail case on the record. When Luke and I finally returned to the house, the atmosphere was thick with forced artificial pleasantries. Patricia was lounging in the main living room, flipping through an expensive architectural magazine and pretending she belonged there. Chelsea was pacing near the front windows, constantly checking her phone, likely waiting for updates from Preston about his supposed heist. Preston himself emerged from the guest wing a few minutes later. He looked like a man who had just won a championship title. His chest was puffed out, his posture exuded arrogant confidence, and he offered me a wide, predatory smile as I walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. "Good afternoon, Gemma," Preston said, his voice loud and booming, intentionally drawing the attention of Patricia and Chelsea. "Did you have a productive morning? I hope you and Luke are getting your affairs in order for our little meeting tomorrow." I took a slow sip of my water, leaning against the counter. "It was a very productive morning, Preston. Very clarifying. We are looking forward to finalizing everything." Preston chuckled a deep, condescending sound. "Good. I am glad you are finally seeing reason. It is much easier when everyone cooperates and lets the professionals handle the heavy lifting." I spent the morning reviewing some market trends and finalizing the trust structures. "I think you are going to be very surprised by the comprehensive strategy I have put together for your assets." "I am sure I will be shocked," I replied smoothly. My tone was perfectly level, betraying absolutely none of the lethal intent simmering just beneath the surface. "Have you prepared all the necessary documentation for the transfer?" "Everything is ready, Gemma," Preston boasted, leaning against the kitchen island, invading my personal space to emphasize his perceived dominance. "My legal team has reviewed everything thoroughly. We have a rock-solid case for restructuring. You just show up, sign the proxy agreement, and I will make all your father's nasty federal problems disappear. It will be painless." Chelsea walked into the kitchen, sidling up next to her husband. She looped her arm through his, looking at me with a sickeningly sweet, triumphant expression. "Preston has been working so hard on this, Gemma. You really should be grateful. He is saving your little business from getting caught up in Dad's crossfire. You owe him a massive thank you for taking this burden off your shoulders." "You have no idea how grateful I am for Preston's efforts today," I said softly. "He has definitely secured his own fate." Preston laughed again, entirely oblivious to the double meaning of my words. He reached out and patted my shoulder, a patronizing gesture that made my skin crawl. "Just leave the complicated math to me, sweetheart. I will see you at the boardroom." I watched them walk away, whispering excitedly to each other, as they headed back to the guest wing to continue plotting my demise. They were practically vibrating with greed. They were absolutely convinced they held the ultimate trump card. They believed they had the financial data to destroy my company if I refused to surrender my wealth. They thought they had cornered the naive high school dropout. They thought they had trapped the blue-collar tradesman. They were utterly tragically blind to the fact that they were dancing on a floor made of thin glass, and I was holding the hammer. Friday afternoon was approaching fast, and the impact was going to be absolutely catastrophic. Thursday night settled over the estate with a heavy, oppressive silence. The relentless rain from earlier in the week had finally stopped, leaving behind a chilling frost that coated the expansive windows of the master suite. Luke was already asleep, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the dark room. He needed his rest for the execution we were about to perform tomorrow. I, however, was wide awake. The adrenaline of the impending strike coursed through my veins, making sleep entirely impossible. I sat at my private vanity, the soft glow of my secured tablet illuminating my face. I opened the centralized security application. While Preston had been busy fumbling with dummy files on my office desktop, he had remained entirely ignorant of the comprehensive surveillance network woven into the very architecture of this house. We did not just have cameras on the exterior doors. For the safety of our son and the security of our corporate assets, discrete audio and video monitors were seamlessly integrated into the crown molding of the main hallways, including the guest wing. I tapped the screen, pulling up the live feed of the eastern corridor where Patricia and Chelsea were currently staying. The hallway was dimly lit by motion sensor sconces. For a moment, the screen showed nothing but empty space. Then a figure stepped out of the primary guest suite. It was Patricia. She was wearing a silk robe that she had undoubtedly found in my linen closet, wrapping it tightly around her thin frame. She was clutching her cell phone to her ear, pacing the length of the hardwood floor with frantic, aggressive energy. Her face stripped of the artificial sweetness she wore in front of the catering staff and wealthy investors was contorted into a nasty, bitter scowl. I touched the volume icon on my screen, increasing the audio feed. Richard must have managed to secure a phone call from the federal holding facility, or perhaps he was utilizing the last remaining favor of a sympathetic guard. Either way, Patricia was speaking to my father, and she was not holding back. "Stop panicking!" "Richard!" Patricia hissed into the receiver, her voice sharp and vicious, completely unbothered by the late hour. "I told you Preston has it entirely under control. He secured all their financial data this morning. We are going to bleed that electrician dry." I leaned closer to the tablet, my eyes locked on the harsh lines of my mother's face. "They are so incredibly gullible," Patricia continued, letting out a short, cruel laugh that echoed in the quiet hallway. "You should see them, Richard. They live in this massive house, but they have absolutely no class. They still act like common laborers. Gemma actually served Chelsea tap water yesterday." Tap water. It is pathetic. But it works perfectly for us. Preston is going to bring the proxy documents to the lawyer tomorrow afternoon. Gemma is terrified of us exposing her little teenage arrest record. She is going to sign over every single asset they have just to keep our mouths shut. She paused, listening to whatever Richard was barking through the phone. She rolled her eyes, her expression hardening into something truly demonic. "I know you hate relying on her," Patricia snapped back. "I hate it too. Looking at her face every day is a constant reminder of how much she disappointed us. But you need to look at the big picture. We use their liquid capital to pay off your federal bond and satisfy the immediate SEC fines. Once the wire transfer clears and your accounts are unfrozen, we will drain the rest of their corporate accounts dry. We will take everything of value and transfer it directly into Preston's offshore trusts." My breath caught in my throat, not from sadness, but from the sheer breathtaking magnitude of her malice. She was not just trying to survive a crisis. She was actively plotting to annihilate my family. And then Patricia asked, repeating Richard's question with a wicked, delighted smile spreading across her face. "Then we do exactly what we should have done the second we got the money. We change the locks on this ridiculous estate. We take control of the holding company. We will kick that ungrateful little brat right back out onto the street where she belongs, just like you did 15 years ago." She stopped pacing, leaning against the hallway wall as she delivered her final, devastating verdict. "I should have forced her to get rid of that baby when she first told us she was pregnant. I should have marched her to a clinic myself. She ruined her life for that blue-collar loser, and she embarrassed this entire family. She is nothing but white trash, Richard, and trash will always remain trash. We will take the money and we will throw them back into the gutter." The call ended shortly after. Patricia tucked the phone into the pocket of her stolen silk robe and walked back into the guest suite, shutting the door firmly behind her. I sat in the dark of my master bedroom, staring at the frozen frame of the security feed. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the steady, calm breathing of my husband beside me. For 15 years, a tiny, irrational, deeply buried part of my inner child had wondered if perhaps I had been too harsh. I had sometimes wondered if the passage of time might have softened their hearts, if the birth of my beautiful son might have sparked a glimmer of genuine maternal instinct in the woman who brought me into the world. Society conditions us to believe that family is sacred, that blood bonds carry an inherent unconditional love that can weather any storm. Listening to that audio file completely eradicated that toxic myth from my mind forever. Patricia did not see me as a daughter. She did not see me as a human being with feelings, struggles, or intrinsic value. She saw me as a biological ATM, an inferior disposable resource to be mined and then violently discarded when she was finished extracting the wealth. She looked at my brilliant, kind-hearted son and saw nothing but a mistake she wished she had erased. She looked at my devoted, hard-working husband and saw nothing but dirt on his hands. Any residual guilt I might have harbored about the financial execution I was about to perform evaporated instantly. It turned to ash, blown away by the freezing, absolute certainty taking root in my chest. I did not cry. I did not feel the familiar suffocating sting of rejection that used to paralyze me when I was a teenager. I felt incredibly wonderfully detached. It was the clinical detachment of a surgeon preparing to excise a rotting malignant tumor from a healthy body. I tapped the screen of my tablet. I highlighted the entire audio and video log of Patricia's hallway confession. I hit export, encrypting the file with a military-grade passcode and sent a direct copy to my private legal server. I then forwarded a secondary copy directly to Attorney Davis with a single line of text attached. Print the final foreclosure notices. We are taking absolutely everything. I set the tablet down on the vanity and walked over to the bed. I slid under the heavy, warm duvet and wrapped my arm across Luke's chest, resting my head against his shoulder. He shifted slightly in his sleep, instinctively pulling me closer, surrounding me with the solid, protective warmth that he had provided since the very first day we met. This was my family, the man holding me and the teenage boy sleeping peacefully down the hall. They were the only blood that mattered. Patricia and her entire parasitic lineage were about to learn a very brutal lesson about the real world. They firmly believed they were apex predators manipulating a weak, foolish prey. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they had willingly walked directly into a slaughterhouse. I closed my eyes, a calm, genuine smile touching my lips. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow, at exactly 2 in the afternoon, the masks were coming off. And I was going to sleep perfectly tonight, knowing exactly how loud they were going to scream. Friday morning passed with agonizing, exquisite slowness. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Luke and I stepped out of our chauffeured vehicle in front of a towering, glass-encased Class A office building right in the heart of the financial district. This was not just any corporate high-rise. This architectural marvel was the crown jewel of the downtown skyline, and Luke's corporation had personally engineered, installed, and secured every single inch of its multi-million-dollar electrical infrastructure. The building manager greeted Luke by name the moment we walked through the revolving doors, treating him with the utmost deference and professional respect. We bypassed the standard security desk and took the private executive elevator straight to the top floor. Attorney Davis was already waiting for us in the VIP boardroom. The room was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. A massive, highly polished mahogany table stretched across the center, surrounded by heavy, ergonomic leather chairs. The walls were pure transparent glass, offering an unobstructed, dizzying panoramic view of the bustling city below. We took our seats at the head of the table, facing the heavy double doors. I placed my designer briefcase carefully on the polished wood. Inside was the secure flash drive containing the security footage and the audio recording resting right alongside the heavy red-sealed bankruptcy folios that officially confirmed our total unyielding ownership of my family's entire financial existence. At precisely 2 o'clock, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. They walked in exactly as I knew they would, marching into the room like a royal procession arriving to collect tributes from the peasants. Richard led the pack. He had managed to secure a temporary release on bail from the federal holding facility, likely using the absolute last drops of leverage and favors he possessed in this city. Despite facing federal indictment and decades in a penitentiary for defrauding investors, he wore a bespoke charcoal gray suit and carried himself with the exact same tyrannical arrogance that had defined his entire life. He did not look like a disgraced, desperate criminal. He looked like a king expecting an overdue coronation. Patricia and Chelsea flanked him dressed as if they were attending an exclusive high society gala rather than an emergency financial restructuring meeting to save their patriarch from prison. Patricia was draped in a tailored cream pantsuit, her neck and wrists glittering with heavy, ostentatious diamond jewelry. It was the very same jewelry that currently belonged to my holding company following the emergency asset liquidation. Chelsea wore a bright, obnoxious designer dress, clutching a luxury handbag, and sporting a smug, victorious sneer. They looked absolutely ridiculous wearing their visible wealth like a suit of armor to hide the terrifying fact that they were completely and utterly bankrupt. Preston brought up the rear. He carried his leather briefcase with a tight, eager grip, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. Beside him walked a man I had never seen before. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit and had a slick, oily demeanor that screamed bottom-tier defense attorney. This was clearly the man Preston had emailed the stolen files to yesterday, a lawyer desperate or foolish enough to participate in a coordinated corporate extortion plot for a cut of the stolen profits. Richard did not greet me. He did not even acknowledge Luke's presence. He pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the long mahogany table and sat down heavily, resting his hands flat on the surface to assert his dominance. Patricia and Chelsea took their seats along the side, crossing their arms in unison. They leaned back, staring at me with expressions of utter, unshakable superiority. They were fully prepared to watch me surrender. They expected me to be trembling, intimidated by the sheer corporate atmosphere and terrified of the blackmail material they firmly believed they held. Preston remained standing. He unclasped his briefcase with a loud, dramatic snap and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed them onto the center of the table with a triumphant thud. He smoothed his tie, looking between Luke and me, with a patronizing, predatory grin that made my stomach turn. "Well," Gemma Preston announced, his voice echoing loudly in the spacious boardroom, "I hope you and Luke got a good night of sleep. Today is a big day for everyone. We have the transfer of executive control documents ready to execute along with the offshore trust restructuring agreements. My associate here, Mr. Higgins, has reviewed everything to ensure the transition of your assets is seamless and entirely binding." The sleazy lawyer Higgins offered a tight artificial smile to the room. "We just need a few signatures," Higgins said smoothly, tapping the thick stack of paperwork with his pen. "This will legally shield the contracting corporation's liquid assets under my client's wealth management firm. Once the ink is dry, we can authorize the immediate wire transfer to cover Richard's federal bail bond and begin dealing with the SEC inquiries. It is a very straightforward standard process." Richard leaned forward, glaring at me from across the expanse of polished wood. "Stop wasting time," Richard commanded, his voice sharp and aggressive, attempting to bully me into submission just like he did when I was a teenager. "The feds are breathing down my neck. We do not have time to sit here and coddle your fragile ego, Gemma. You brought us to this fancy office to make yourself feel important, fine. You had your little power trip. Now pick up a pen and sign the proxy over to Preston so we can get this family back on track." Patricia chimed in, adjusting her diamond necklace with a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. "Honestly, Gemma, you should be thanking us on your knees. Preston is doing you a massive favor by stepping in to manage this capital. You and Luke are completely out of your depth in these high-level matters. By Friday evening, you will not have to worry about a single thing. We are taking the heavy burden completely off your shoulders." Chelsea leaned across the table, her eyes locking onto mine. Her voice dropped, taking on a venomous, highly threatening edge designed only for me to hear clearly. "And remember our little conversation in the wine cellar yesterday, Gemma. You know exactly what is at stake here. You know exactly what Dad will do to your perfect little life if you try to back out now. Your pristine corporate reputation relies heavily on you making the smart cooperative choice today. Do not make us do something we will all deeply regret." I sat perfectly still. I did not reach for the documents. I did not flinch at Richard's aggressive commands. I did not cower at Chelsea's blatant extortion. I just looked at them. I took in the full pathetic picture of their absolute delusion. They were sitting in a building powered by my husband's empire. They were demanding my money to save themselves from a federal prison sentence. They were actively threatening me with a crime I did not commit using stolen financial data that was entirely useless. They thought they were holding all the cards, completely oblivious to the fact that I owned the entire table. Luke sat beside me, utterly motionless. His face was a mask of cold professional detachment, but I could feel the coiled energy radiating from him. He was ready. Attorney Davis sat to my right, his hands folded neatly on the table, observing the parasites, with the clinical fascination of a scientist studying a particularly repulsive breed of insect. The board was officially set. The enemy had marched their king, their queen, and their pathetic little pawns right into the dead center of my trap. They were sitting there with their arms crossed, waiting for me to bow my head, pick up the pen, and hand over the keys to my kingdom. Instead, I reached slowly into my designer briefcase. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of the silver remote control that operated the boardroom's advanced audiovisual system. It was time to pull the trigger. I pulled the sleek silver remote from my designer briefcase and placed it gently on the table right next to the thick stack of Preston's fraudulent contracts. Preston misread my deliberate slowness as hesitation. He assumed my silence was born of intimidation. He leaned forward, tapping his manicured index finger aggressively against the signature line of the top document. "Sign it, Gemma." Preston demanded, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. "Stop stalling and sign the proxy over to me. I have read your corporate ledgers. I saw the confidential tax summaries I downloaded from your private server yesterday morning. You are hiding millions in unsanctioned accounts. If you try to fight this executive transfer, I will personally hand over every single byte of that stolen data to the IRS. You and your little electrician husband will be buried in federal audits for the next decade. Resistance is completely pointless at this stage. Just surrender the assets and we can all walk away quietly." Attorney Davis did not say a word. He simply reached into his tailored breast pocket and produced a polished silver USB drive. He set it down with a sharp, heavy clink right on top of Preston's extortion paperwork. I pressed the master button on my remote control. Instantly, the heavy mechanical blackout blinds descended over the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, sealing us inside the room and blocking out the bright afternoon sun. The ambient lights dimmed automatically, shifting the atmosphere from a standard corporate meeting to a high-stakes interrogation. A massive digital projector screen smoothly lowered from the ceiling directly behind my chair. I pressed a second button on the remote. The screen flared to life in brilliant high definition. It was the security feed from my home office. The date and timestamp flashed clearly in the bottom right corner, proving the footage was captured less than 36 hours ago. Everyone at the table watched in stunned, breathless silence as a nervous, profusely sweating Preston crept into the video frame. The audio was crystal clear, capturing the rapid, shallow breaths he took as he bypassed my intentionally weak lock screen. The video showed him plugging his silver flash drive into my terminal, his face illuminated by the monitor's glow as he greedily downloaded the folder labeled as highly confidential corporate tax summaries. I paused the video right on a freeze frame of Preston's triumphant, greedy smirk. I looked across the table at his suddenly pale face. "You see, Preston," I explained, my voice echoing coldly in the darkened boardroom. "That folder did not contain our actual financial records. It contained obsolete municipal bid drafts, rejected supply chain invoices, and discarded restructuring plans. But more importantly, our corporate IT department had embedded those specific files with active tracking beacons. The moment you plugged that flash drive into your laptop and emailed the contents to your attorney here, our secure system logged your exact IP address, the destination server, and the precise timestamp of the data transfer. You did not secure leverage against me. You committed felony corporate espionage and documented your own cyber theft on our secure servers." Higgins, the sleazy lawyer Preston had brought along, physically recoiled in his leather chair. His eyes darted from the frozen image of Preston on the giant screen to the silver USB drive resting on the table. The smug confidence he had carried into the room vanished instantly, replaced by stark, visceral terror. But I am not quite finished, I announced, pressing another button on the remote. Let us address the beautiful foundation of family unity my mother spoke so highly of at dinner last night. The projector screen went black and a pristine audio file began to play over the boardroom's premium surround sound speakers. It was Patricia's voice stripped of all her artificial sweetness, ringing out with vicious, unadulterated malice. "We are going to bleed that electrician dry," Patricia's recorded voice echoed off the mahogany walls. "As soon as the wire transfer clears and your bond is posted, we are changing the locks on the estate and kicking that ungrateful little brat right back onto the street where she belongs. She is nothing but white trash, Richard, and trash will always remain trash. We will take the money and we will throw them back into the gutter." I clicked the remote, cutting off the audio. The recording stopped, leaving behind a silence so absolute and heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. The psychological whiplash was spectacular. Patricia let out a strangled, suffocating gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated horror as the reality of her own venomous words, being played back in a professional corporate setting, sank in. The mask of the loving, misunderstood mother shattered permanently. Everyone in the room had just heard her true, monstrous nature. Chelsea shrank back into her seat, the arrogant sneer completely wiped from her face, replaced by a pale, trembling panic. She realized in that exact moment that her pathetic blackmail attempt in the wine cellar meant absolutely nothing compared to the concrete, highly illegal conspiracy her family had just been caught executing. Richard stared at his wife, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. He was a seasoned financial predator, and he realized instantly that his family had not cleverly trapped a naive victim. They had blindly marched into a lethal execution chamber, handing me the weapons required to destroy them. The breaking point came not from my family but from the legal counsel they had foolishly dragged into the crossfire. Higgins shot up from his chair as if the leather upholstery had suddenly caught fire. He began shoving his legal pads, pens, and unread documents into his battered briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated movements. His hands were visibly shaking as he scrambled to distance himself from his own client. "What are you doing?" Preston demanded, his voice cracking with sudden severe panic as he watched his only shield preparing to flee the room. Higgins zipped his briefcase shut and took a massive step away from Preston. "I am saving my license." Higgins shot back, his voice an octave higher than it had been 10 minutes ago. "I was retained to facilitate a standard voluntary transfer of corporate assets. I was absolutely not informed that my client illegally obtained proprietary financial data through cyber theft. Furthermore, I will not be implicated as an accessory to a coordinated, premeditated extortion plot captured on both video and audio." "You cannot just leave me here," Preston stammered, reaching out a trembling hand. "You are my lawyer." "I am not your anything," Higgins spat. Adjusting his cheap suit jacket with frantic energy, he looked directly at Attorney Davis, raising his hands in a gesture of complete and total surrender. For the official record, Higgins stated loudly, ensuring every word was clear for the legal professionals in the room, "I am formally withdrawing my representation of this client effective immediately. I have no part in this coercion. I advise my former client to secure criminal defense counsel without delay. Good afternoon." Higgins did not wait for an acknowledgement. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted for the boardroom doors, yanking them open and disappearing down the hallway. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, sealing Preston inside with no legal counsel, no leverage, and absolutely no way out. Preston sat frozen in his chair, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered animal. He looked toward Richard for help, but my father was staring straight ahead, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic failure of their master plan. I pressed the remote one final time, raising the mechanical blinds and bringing the bright city sunlight back into the room. The harsh illumination washed over their terrified faces, exposing every line of panic and desperation. I picked up the silver USB drive from the table and held it between my fingers, letting the metal catch the light. "This drive contains everything I said," my voice cutting through the lingering shock. "It holds the undeniable proof of corporate espionage, unauthorized data breaches, and a blatant conspiracy to commit extortion. It is enough evidence to ensure that you, Preston, spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary, right alongside Richard. And you, Patricia, would likely face conspiracy charges that would land you in a neighboring cell. You came into my home, ate my food, and plotted to destroy my family. You brought a knife to a gunfight, Preston. And you just shot yourself. The silence that followed my declaration was abruptly shattered by a violent, echoing crash. Richard slammed his open palms down onto the polished mahogany table with such explosive force that the heavy leather chairs actually rattled. The last remaining shreds of his carefully maintained composure vanished completely. He was a cornered predator, realizing for the first time that his teeth had been pulled, but his monumental ego simply refused to accept the reality of his defeat. He sprang up from his chair, his face contorted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You dare trap your own family!" Richard roared, his voice vibrating with absolute fury, completely ignoring the fact that they had just attempted to extort me moments ago. "You think you are some kind of strategic genius because you recorded a few desperate conversations? You think because you managed to protect your little house and your husband's business that you have actually won?" He leaned over the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face, attempting to summon the terrifying authority he used to wield over me when I was a child. "I am Richard Sterling. I built a financial empire from the ground up while you were still playing with crayons. You think I am finished because of a temporary federal freeze? You think I actually needed your pathetic charity? I have a contact list filled with the wealthiest venture capitalists and institutional lenders in this country. I will make a single phone call and find another investor by the end of the business day. I will secure the capital, I will post my bond, and I will reclaim my mansion. I do not need a single cent of your dirty tradesman money." I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I just looked at him, letting his desperate, pathetic rant echo into the soundproof walls of the executive boardroom. He truly believed he still had a safety net. He firmly thought his vast network of high society friends and corrupt bankers would throw him a life preserver. He was completely blind to the fact that his ship had not just sunk, it had been entirely vaporized. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of malice, but one of absolute, untouchable victory. I reached into my designer briefcase one final time. I bypassed the flash drives and the security logs, wrapping my fingers around the thick, heavy legal folio that Attorney Davis had prepared for us earlier that week. I pulled it out and set it down on the table. The stark crimson stamp of the federal bankruptcy court seal glowed brightly against the stark white cover. With a single smooth motion, I slid the heavy file across the long mahogany table. It glided over the polished wood, stopping perfectly right in front of Richard's clenched fists. "You do not need to find another investor, Richard," I said softly, my voice carrying the lethal precision of a sniper's bullet. Richard looked down at the file, his chest heaving. He did not touch it. He stared at the federal seal as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Patricia and Chelsea leaned forward, their eyes wide with sudden paralyzing dread, completely unable to comprehend what other devastating weapon I could possibly have left to deploy. "Last week, when the federal courts ordered the emergency liquidation of your entire existence to satisfy the SEC fines, a private LLC stepped in," I explained, keeping my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. "That anonymous company purchased all your toxic debt for pennies on the dollar. They bought the total ownership rights to your distressed assets. That includes the deed to your sprawling suburban mansion, the holding company that owns Chelsea's overpriced estate, and the corporate financing on all three of Preston's precious Porsches. Do you know who owns that company?" The air in the boardroom evaporated. Richard's face turned the color of wet ash. His eyes darted from the red federal seal up to my face, the horrific, impossible realization finally crashing down upon him with the force of a freight train. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The arrogant, tyrannical billionaire was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own destruction. Luke stepped forward. He moved away from his chair and walked slowly to the edge of the table, leaning his hip against the polished mahogany. He crossed his arms over his chest, projecting the calm, unshakable authority of a man who had built an empire with his bare hands. He looked down at the man who had once called his unborn child a disgrace. "It belongs to the electrician you threw out of your house 15 years ago. Luke said, his voice deep, resonant, and echoing with absolute finality. Patricia let out a sharp, suffocating gasp, clapping a hand over her mouth. Chelsea physically recoiled, pressing herself as far back into her leather chair as possible, her eyes darting frantically between Luke and the legal folio. Preston just sat there, completely catatonic, his brain short-circuiting as he realized the cars he used to define his entire personality now legally belonged to the blue-collar worker he had spent the last 48 hours mocking. "Currently, I am your sole legal creditor," Luke continued, addressing Richard directly, his tone devoid of any anger or vindictiveness. It was simply the cold, hard delivery of a corporate execution. "I own the roof over your head. I own the vehicles in your driveway. I own the debt you used to fund your fake glamorous lifestyle. And I have made my decision regarding your accounts." Luke paused, letting the agonizing silence stretch out, forcing them to hang on his every word. "There will be no extensions," Luke stated firmly. "There will be no restructuring, no grace periods, and absolutely no negotiations. We are enacting total asset seizure across the board. The foreclosure notices have already been filed with the city clerk. As of right now, you are officially homeless." The absolute finality of the statement struck the room like a physical blow. The game was entirely over. There were no more moves left on the board. The parasites had marched into this corporate suite expecting to bully a naive housewife and a gullible tradesman out of millions. Instead, they had just been handed their own financial death certificates by the very people they considered beneath their notice. "You cannot do this!" Patricia wailed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. She jumped up from her chair, her diamond bracelets clinking loudly against the wood table. "You cannot take our home. Where are we supposed to go? All of our belongings are in that house. My clothes, my jewelry, my entire life is in there. You cannot just throw your own mother out onto the street." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The woman who had literally thrown me out onto the street in a freezing rainstorm while I was 20 years old and pregnant was now demanding mercy for her designer wardrobe. "Your personal belongings have already been packed into cardboard boxes by a professional moving crew." I informed her, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for her manufactured tears. "They have been placed securely on the curb outside the front gates of the estate. The locks on the mansion were changed an hour ago by my corporate security team. Your access codes have been disabled. If you attempt to trespass on my property, you will be arrested." Chelsea burst into tears, ugly heaving sobs that ruined her expensive makeup. "But my house!" Chelsea cried out, looking frantically at Preston for support. "Preston, tell them they cannot take our house. Tell them it is illegal." Preston did not say a word. He could not. He knew exactly how corporate debt acquisition worked. He knew that everything Luke and I had done was perfectly legal, perfectly documented, and completely irreversible. He just stared blankly at the federal seal on the folio, realizing that his fake wealth management firm, his leased luxury lifestyle, and his entire artificial identity had just been vaporized by a single stroke of an electrician's pen. Richard slowly sank back down into his leather chair. The fight had completely drained out of him. The tyrannical patriarch, the man who had controlled his family through fear and financial manipulation for decades, was reduced to a hollow, empty shell. He looked at the legal folio containing his ruin, his hands trembling violently. "You planned this," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "You planned this from the very beginning. You let us come into your home. You let us think we had the upper hand just so you could pull the rug out from under us." "I did not plan your federal indictment, Richard," I replied, picking up my briefcase and preparing to leave. "I did not force you to commit securities fraud, and I certainly did not force Preston to commit corporate espionage on my private servers. You dug your own graves. I simply bought the cemetery." I looked at the four of them sitting around the magnificent boardroom table. They looked pathetic, stripped of their arrogance and their stolen wealth. They were finally forced to confront the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world, a world where actions have severe consequences, and where the people you discard might one day hold the keys to your survival. "My legal team will handle all future correspondence regarding the asset seizures," I announced, turning toward the double doors. "Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my estate. Do not ever attempt to contact me or my son again. Enjoy the reality of the blue-collar lifestyle you always found so disgusting." Luke placed a protective, loving hand on my lower back, guiding me toward the exit. We walked out of the executive boardroom without looking back, leaving the heavy mahogany doors to swing shut behind us, sealing them inside the tomb of their own making. Even as the heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind us, sealing the room, the thick soundproof glass walls of the executive boardroom offered a crystal-clear, unobstructed view of their absolute destruction. I paused in the reception area, turning back just for a moment to watch the silent, devastating movie of their collapse unfold. It was a masterpiece of their own making. Patricia was the first to fall. Her knees completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed right onto the expensive corporate carpeting, her hands clawing desperately at the lapels of her tailored cream pantsuit as she began to wail. The thick glass muted the audio of her screams, but the sheer agonizing physical desperation in her frantic movements was unmistakable. She was pounding her fists against the floor, begging and pleading to an empty room that had absolutely zero mercy left to give her. The grand matriarch, who had built her entire identity on wealth and superiority, was now reduced to a groveling, hysterical mess on the floor of my husband's building. Chelsea did not rush to comfort her mother. There was no loyalty in that family, only shared opportunism. When the money vanished, the familial bonds instantly disintegrated. Instead of helping Patricia, all of Chelsea's toxic pent-up rage found a new immediate target. She turned her venomous focus entirely on Preston. I watched her scream at him, her face twisted into an ugly, hateful snarl, her hands gesturing wildly toward the projector screen and the red-sealed bankruptcy folios. Preston threw his hands up in a defensive, pathetic posture, trying to explain away his catastrophic failure, desperately trying to justify the corporate espionage and the staggering, insurmountable debt he had just locked them into. Chelsea did not want to hear his excuses. Her hand shot out with blinding speed. She slapped Preston across the face with such vicious, unbridled force that his head violently snapped to the side. That single resounding physical strike marked the definitive bitter end of their pathetic, illusionary marriage. They had built their entire relationship on leased luxury, mutual greed, and superficial social climbing. With the money permanently vaporized and the threat of federal prison hanging over Preston's head, there was absolutely nothing left holding them together but raw, boiling resentment. Richard remained standing near his heavy leather chair, completely paralyzed. His face was devoid of all color, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out, pathetic ghost of the tyrannical billionaire he had been just an hour ago. He stared blankly through the glass partition, his eyes slowly finding mine one last time. In that fleeting second of eye contact, I saw the crushing, undeniable realization finally hit him. The daughter he had deemed worthless, the daughter he had discarded like trash, now held the absolute terrifying power of life and death over his entire existence. The blue-collar worker he had endlessly mocked was the architect of his total ruin. I offered my father a single brief, icy nod, officially acknowledging his absolute defeat. I turned away from the glass and walked over to the building's head of security, who was waiting respectfully by the private elevators. I instructed him to escort the occupants of the boardroom out of the building immediately. I specified that they were to be taken down through the freight elevator and deposited directly onto the back alley street, ensuring they did not taint the main lobby with their hysterical breakdown. The karma they endured that evening was swift, brutal, and unsparing. Without access to their frozen accounts, their seized luxury vehicles, or their foreclosed properties, the harsh reality of their new poverty hit them with devastating force. Through the meticulous legal updates Attorney Davis provided over the following days, I learned exactly how their first night of exile had ended. They were forced to haul the cardboard boxes containing their designer clothes away from the curb of their former estate in a cheap rented moving van. They spent their first night of homelessness crammed into a dingy roadside motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. Preston had to use a nearly maxed-out, high-interest credit card just to secure the single room, the plastic barely clearing the machine. They went from dining on imported Wagyu beef in my custom kitchen to eating vending machine snacks on stained, questionable mattresses. They had tumbled straight from the penthouse to the gutter in a matter of hours. Over the next few weeks, the unforgiving wheels of the federal justice system ground Richard's legacy into fine dust. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not offer lenient plea deals to men who stole pensions to fund their wives' diamond collections. Richard was formally convicted of multiple counts of securities fraud, insider trading, and wire fraud. He was sentenced to a lengthy, unappealable term in a federal penitentiary. The man who had once demanded respect and unquestioning obedience was now just a designated number in a jumpsuit, permanently stripped of his name, his immense power, and his freedom. Chelsea made good on the violent promise of that boardroom slap. She filed for a highly contested divorce from Preston the very next week, desperately trying to untangle herself from his crushing corporate debt and the looming threat of his own legal investigations for the cyber espionage he committed against my firm. Preston disappeared into the chaotic legal system, fighting tooth and nail to stay out of a cell right next to his former father-in-law. Patricia, the woman who had proudly declared me white trash and demanded I be thrown onto the street, faced the ultimate humiliating reality check. With Richard locked away in prison and all their assets entirely liquidated by my holding company, she was left with absolutely no safety net. She was forced to pawn the very diamond jewelry she had worn to our meeting just to afford the security deposit on a tiny, dilapidated rental apartment in a rough, working-class neighborhood. The elite socialite who adamantly refused to drink tap water was now living a life she had spent her entire existence mocking. She had finally become the exact thing she so deeply despised. I did not feel sorry for them. I did not lose a single second of sleep over their drastic, self-inflicted change in circumstances. 6 months later, the chaos of their spectacular downfall felt like a distant, completely irrelevant news story. It was a warm, beautiful Saturday evening. The air was thick with the rich, savory scent of barbecue. I sat in a comfortable lounge chair on the expansive stone patio of our estate, holding a glass of iced tea. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold, amber, and deep purple, casting a warm, incredibly peaceful glow over our sprawling backyard. A few yards away, Luke was standing at the custom outdoor grill, expertly flipping steaks while laughing at a joke Leo had just made. My 14-year-old son was holding a plate, eagerly waiting for his dinner, his face bright with genuine joy. He was completely unburdened by the toxic generational trauma that had shadowed my own youth. He was thriving, brilliant, and deeply kind, a living, breathing testament to the fact that you do not need wealthy, elite bloodlines to raise a good man. You just need actual, unconditional love and respect. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my contacts list and scrolled down to the names I had kept blocked, but lingering in the digital archive for 15 years. Patricia, Richard, Chelsea, Preston. I did not feel a sudden spike of anger looking at those names. I did not feel a lingering ache of rejection. I felt absolutely nothing. They were just letters on a screen, completely powerless and entirely meaningless. I tapped the delete button on each contact one by one, wiping their numbers, their emails, and their very existence from my device permanently. I powered down the phone and set it face down on the small table beside me. The digital tether was completely severed. The final microscopic thread linking me to their toxic bloodline was cut forever. Luke walked over, handing a plate of food to Leo before carrying 2 plates over to where I was sitting. He set them down and took the seat right next to me. He looked at my face, easily reading the absolute unshakable peace settling over my features. He reached out and wrapped his strong, calloused hand around mine. I leaned over and rested my head against his solid, dependable shoulder. The warmth radiating from him was the exact same warmth that had saved me when I was a terrified 20-year-old standing in the freezing rain. "We built a beautiful life," Luke said quietly, watching our son toss a piece of grilled chicken to our golden retriever on the lawn. "We built an empire," I corrected him softly, lacing my fingers securely through his. "And we did it entirely on our own. There would be no more desperate knocks on my door in the middle of the night. There would be no more manipulative phone calls, no more pathetic blackmail attempts, and no more demanding parasites trying to siphon our hard-earned wealth. The past was permanently buried under the heavy weight of their own monumental greed. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of my husband and my son laughing together under the evening sky. It was the beautiful, undeniable sound of absolute, unconditional freedom. The profound journey of Gemma and Luke reveals a universal, yet often painful truth. Blood does not entitle anyone to your peace, your boundaries, or the empire you carefully build. Society frequently conditions us to believe that familial bonds are sacred and unbreakable, pressuring us to endlessly forgive those who share our DNA. However, this story shatters that toxic myth with surgical precision. The true lesson here is that authentic love is measured by consistent respect and support, not by biological obligation. When Gemma was at her most vulnerable, her parents discarded her for failing to fit their superficial, status-driven narrative. Yet when she became a source of immense wealth, they returned not with apologies but with calculated greed and entitlement. By meticulously stripping away their power, she demonstrated that protecting yourself from parasitic family members is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of radical personal preservation. You are under no moral obligation to set yourself on fire to keep your abusers warm. Healing often requires us to build our own chosen families, ones rooted in genuine care, like the unshakable partnership between Gemma and Luke. True closure comes from recognizing your own worth and refusing to let toxic ghosts dictate your future. Please take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and find the courage to cut the ties that no longer serve your mental health.